misses that women are capable of either appearing to possess the symbolic phallus as well, or 50, but speaking of such an also, and more traditionally, of being the symbolic phallus, as objects of desire. Impractical vehicle, as I just mentioned. What if the aforementioned oversized, shiny truck is blasting Johnny Cash? Isn't part of my argument that older music tended to be more authentic, but in the case of the pretentious country boy who really lives in the suburbs, this obviously inauthentic individual is playing authentic music. This actually only underlines my point. What I take issue with is not the thing which we enjoy, but our relationship to that which we enjoy. Enjoy Beyonce all you want. The question is only, what is the nature of said enjoyment? Are we really enjoying the music, or are we enjoying our self-image as enjoying it? In other words, how are we using the music? As a way to console ourselves, lose ourselves, or as a way to define ourselves? I'm on the side of consoling or losing ourselves in music, getting caught up in the moment, and maybe, as Katy Perry's song Last Friday Night says, breaking the law. What I am concerned with is when we fail to perceive that breaking the law, or transgression, acts 51 as the underside of the very social law itself. Snoop Dogg brags about his cars, perhaps mostly, just because he thinks they're cool, and they are. He came from a generation of lumpen proletarians turned petite bourgeois, Dr. Dre having built his own record labels, Death Row Records, and Aftermath Entertainment. But the lyrics of Never Lose Me 2023, on the other hand, are merely just a list of designer brands, which are used just to have something to rhyme with coochie, for instance. They add absolutely nothing else to the song, and seem to be mentioned for their own sake alone. The point of opulence in hip-hop made closer to the turn of the century was just as much to express the wonder of a rags-to-riches story, as it was to claim ownership of the phallus. When Biggie says living better now, cookie sweaters now, this comes as a direct contrast to the story of poverty, lumpen criminality, and struggle which he recounts throughout the album. Super Nintendo, Sega, Genesis, when I was flat broke. Boy, I never pictured this. By the time we get to the era of Cardi B, opulence is being expressed outside of any narrative context at all, for example in the song Money. By this point, phallic superiority through images of wealth then seems to be the entire point in rap music, as opposed to the rags to riches narrative, in which the phallus is only part of the point. I didn't used to have a phallus, but I hustled, and now I've got it. One must admit respect for Cardi B as a person, going from poverty to stripper to multi-millionaire pop star, is a genuine feat. What I don't respect is some of the classist messages put forth by Cardi's music, catchy and danceable as it is. What strikes me is that despite Cardi actually having her own rags to riches story, for whatever reason she never expresses it in her music, despite the fact that the tradition of hip-hop is suffused with such stories. The reason for this I can only guess at. I have no interest in pathologizing her, since for instance, in interviews she appears to be a very kind, genuine and honest person. What is actually easier to pathologize is the reason for the success of the role she is playing, and the ideology behind her songs, of the mass relatability of the at once conformist, and debatably socially destructive messages her music puts forth. The pseudo-culture, of which Cardi is one of the rare creators, surrounds us incessantly with images in which people signal their chances of survival within the dog-eat-dog neoliberal market, and thereby their victory in the game, through their possession of brand name signifiers of wealth. In that sense, the culture is somewhat an accurate representation of what is increasingly almost fact. So, to a significant degree, one cannot fault Cardi for, in her music, simply calling it as it is. She is largely just accurately describing the world. Nonetheless, I find that I feel compelled to be a stick in the mud. The main ideological thrust of Cardi's music reveals that the commodity form takes on a superegoic nature, because survival and opulence are two concepts, which have collapsed into 152. The subtext of, you can have anything you want, becomes, thou shalt enjoy. Simply, if another, you cannot afford excess, then you don't sit on a large enough pile of cash to ensure your survival, and thereby your very dignity. Middle class, for instance, no longer effectively means a modest single-family house with a mortgage. Through having a steady, perhaps blue-collar union job, it means being worth approximately the particular number, depends on where you live. 1.5 million in various assets and investments, with a six-figure cash flow. What we are witnessing is society becoming drowned by a collective death drive, oozing forth from its place of totalizing repression, precisely disguised as the opposite. We often don't realize it, but the highly commodified form of Cardi B's ostensible sexual permissiveness is highly repressive. This is counterintuitive, which is exactly why we tend not to notice the problem. In other words, her promiscuity, usually associated with permissiveness, is
they can't see us, but they can hear us.
Enough. Cardi says, broke boys don't deserve no pussy, followed by a feminine choral echo, as though the opinion of every woman on earth responds, I know that's right. Why is the word deserve?
Go click on YouTube.
It is because
go click on YouTube if you want to hear how he sounds.
Liberalism becomes itself the moral imperative. Greed is good. Broke boys don't deserve pussy, because people who can't take care of them theirs are pathetic, and thereby should not be rewarded with sex. This form of promiscuity is intensely hostile to anything remotely like true love, or even physical love expressed as such. Inside the bonds of monogamy, it stands instead for the hoarding of sex as another resource for manipulative conquest of the field of battle which life has become. Cardi B describes a reality in which there are two kinds of people, ballers, bougie enjoyers, and losers, envious wage slaves. It is of course not as though this necessarily resembles what Cardi actually thinks about life or sex in the context of her personal life, but this is the underlying message of the role which she is playing as a performer. That said, Cardi B is only responding to the conditions which people like Paul Volcker helped to bring her to reality. But nonetheless, I like to imagine the moralistic Mrs. Thatcher teaming up with Cardi B to do a track together, since they are both neoliberal propagandists par excellence. The former, cloaking her corporatist project in the guise of traditional middle-class respectability and conservatism. The latter, idealizing precisely its socially degrading reality. What neoliberalism is in practice, rather than what it was in theory or in rhetoric, is the legal encasement of the corporate market from all democratic control. 53. The end result is that even the most intimate aspects of our lives, like sex, are only part of the game, and open to the vicissitudes of international corporate consumerism. As a person, Cardi ought to be admired for her ability to succeed in this game. I am not disputing this, but can anyone say that the world she describes is really the world we want to live in? Should we have any viable alternative? It isn't a model of love, kindness, honor, respect, dignity, strength, beauty, friendship, or even fun. life, or anything else associated with the good life, which she projects, but rather an idealization of a culture reduced to brand names, materialism, commodity identity, the valorization of avarice, and the invasion of the bureaucratic market into our most intimate affairs. We have largely lost our identities as citizens and community members, which have been replaced by identities as consumers and/or aspiring bourgeois warriors of the economic field of battle of all against all. It is not that Cardi brought about this change, but it is rather a case of art imitating life. The ego ideal expressed by Cardi is that of non-castration. This can only mean an ego ideal that I am above the very symbolic law, or even perhaps that I am the symbolic law. Cardi B need not be a narcissist in order to contribute to a cultural narcissism. Pathological narcissism exists between us all, as the way we interact with each other, we conform to what we believe is expected of us, and in doing so we perform psychosis for this corporatist symbolic order. Miller complicates the very distinction between the symbolic and psychotic. As a matter of fact, a delusion is symbolic. A delusion is a symbolic term, and a delusion is able to order a world. Ask yourself if what orders our world is not for a large part a delusion. The symbolic has become psychotic, the culture has gone mad. Ideals such as solidarity, camaraderie, devotion, even compassion, become almost symbolically impossible in such a world, where what the spectacular other expects from us is to constantly not give a fuck. Make no mistake, Cardi B's wet-ass pussy is the phallus. She both is and has the phallus, operating simultaneously in the feminine 54, and honestly, under the conditions, more power to her. My point is merely two and masculine forms. Preserve the ideal of a world in which there would be no need for any individual to posture as being, or being in possession of the phallus, just to survive in our bizarrely paradoxical anti-social society. Seventh, doing better. It's a beautiful world for you. For you, it's not for me. Devo 1981. There is a collection of artists of a middling or underground level of success who have managed to claw a career out with dignity despite the super control of big record labels, but who also aren't 55 Morrissey, love him, hate him, necessarily defining themselves in mere opposition to the mainstream, or don't know who that is. He is one of these artists. While he is not short of criticisms for lockjawed pop stars thicker than pig shit with nothing to convey, his identity as a person and artist is anything but a signifier, merely responding to the cathedral of corporate pop. Jill Scott is another one of these artists. Scott's music has to be the perfect opposite of the phenomenon of pop transcendence, although she is not in opposition to this phenomenon. Take the songs A Long Walk, or The Way for examples of magnificently poeticizing everyday life. Take some absolute bangers like Golden, or its love for ways of doing upbeat, egoic and hopeful, without being vague or trite. A Long Walk just brings us on a walk with Scott and her thoughts, and The Way takes us through her morning routine. Somehow the way these songs are written, performed and accompanied turns these average stories into something that doesn't need to be transcended, but rather fills the everyday to the brim with passion, love, power, honesty and energy. In a word, soul. Scott poeticizes everyday life, and she also challenges and criticizes it as she sees it. It is in artists like these that I can see that Thatcher's dream of remaking the heart and soul through economic means has not been completely successful. Scott too calls it like she sees it. First thing when I wake up, and right before I close my eyes at night, I think, sense, feel man-like I'm under some kind of microscope. Satellites over my head, transmitters in my dollars, hawking, watching, scoping, jockeying, scrutinizing me. You busy watching me. That you're blind, baby. You neglect to see. The drugs coming into my community, weapons coming into my community, dirty cops in my community. And you keep saying that I'm free. And you keep saying that I'm free. She looks dead in the face, the American ideology of freedom, and calls it out on its bullshit. Freedom is a concept for Americans which has collapsed into the concept of big capital, despite the fact that free enterprise has become in practice only a euphemism for the deliberate attack on democracy through the legal imprisonment of corporate bureaucracies. 56 waves of austerity bring waves of crime, and conveniently, government spending comes right after the fall on increased and more hostile police presence. The identity of freedom with capitalism results in the identity of America with capitalism. The difference between America and other parts of the world, for example, even our English mother, is that England has capitalism while America is capitalism, has chosen to define itself as a form of heavily consolidated state capitalism.
My fellow Americans,
We Americans, in fact, are one of the most unfree and hyper-controlled societies. It's a spectacular and thereby pretty vague definition, not one grounded in the lived experience of the community. David McCarrick freedom as the possession of timenergy promises to be much more meaningful. The only option besides complaining at this point is pure and simple escapism, which I have no problem with, so long as it isn't of the narcissistic transcendent variety. There is a difference between escaping your life briefly, by temporarily dissolving
It's almost over. We're almost
lost
there.
in some diverting activity.
We're almost there.
About your life to
We're gonna
permanently
let it
avoid
finish,
reality.
though.
Mostly, the working class does not attempt to define itself by political labels, and often can't afford the things people like to buy to define themselves. The working class lacks the time, money, and energy to waste on such ridiculous pursuits. But generally, it still aspires to a life defined by increased consumer capacity, a life in which such a vapid self-definition would be possible. Probably the largest exception to being primarily defined by a consumer identity, or an identity that shares that structure at least,
end
are those
here
who
in a
choose to
sec.
have children.
Actually,
Parent becomes a symbolic
I
grounding
just
for the
realized
life.
we're at
But
time,
increasingly for
so-
parents, worsened economic conditions mean that parent is all they ever have the time energy to be. They must neglect the
We're
rest of
gonna
themselves.
reveal-
For the most part, the working
reveal
class
our
lives in the real
faces
world,
here.
where what matters is getting the most
All right, everybody. Hey.
Actually create laws. Make people get past whatever like racial differences they have by utilizing it through humor. You fucking stick up your ass, motherfuckers, with your PhD and your fucking PhD shit and fucking sensitivity training. That ain't how motherfuckers establish meaningful relationships. So shut the fuck up and learn something from us. That's how we do it. And the way they do it is obvious.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to The Turn. Good morning. How's it going? We're live. This is officially live. We're on YouTube. Everyone can see us. Everybody here now and in the future. How's it going, Benjamin? Good to see you. Sean?
Great to be here.
Indeed.
What's up?
What's up, guys? All right.
What's up?
So we're going to just kind of get right after it. I have some opening remarks. It was originally going to be a full-blown lecture, but after I did 3 hours on the concept of the turn last week, I am going to cut myself some slack here and basically do a public-facing version of that, which can be a very short little transmission, I think. It doesn't have to be as esoteric, right? And so welcome, everybody on YouTube. I think we might start doing that kind of warming up the space ahead of time thing a little more often, which is just like letting stuff play before we actually are going, so that you can kind of warm it up so that you have something to watch while we're setting up. But now that we're here, make sure to smash like and all those things. Remember, if you're in the live listening audience, your job is to help us stay on task and only clarify things when we need to for workers with earbuds who don't have thumbs on their devices, who aren't in the live chat. Because ultimately we're making this for its replay value as much as we are for you, the live audience. And we do also obviously love you, the live audience. Now here on the Zoom side, we've got quite the little crew. I'm going to shout out everybody here as we get going. We've got myself, obviously. I'm David McCarricker with Theory Underground. Then we've got Nance and Sean and David Ruiz and Benjamin Studebaker, Cleo Cards, Mix Jacob, Kier, Adrian, Greg of the Recovering Anarchist, back on Substack officially, everybody. Get on that. As well as Jordan, Mikey, Will, Evan, and Federico. Great to have you all here. Now, I'm going to just get right to business, all right? So, the turn. Quick little explanation of the turn is that if you've heard of the concept of converdictions, or of Tribunal Zero, or of going from scene to milieu, or of the post-class fractured mass in alien anthropology, or of institution building and T3 institutions, time, energy, tutelage, and talent. If you've heard us talking about meta-theurgy, if you've heard us talking about the idea of the monastery or 3 principles for study as a way of life, or hey kid, what's the hurry? Or if you've been wondering about the 5 essential problems, questions, and concepts, not to mention thinkers and fields, here at Theory Underground, if you're thinking about all that, you're wondering about all of that, if that keeps you up at night or just kind of keeps you coming back going, what the heck is going on here? Well, it all culminates in the turn. And because I only had 2 hours of sleep during my lecture, or prior to my lecture last week, it was a little meandery and it was hard for me to pull it all together. But the short way of saying it is that every concept I've ever come up with is a concept that comes out of the work of organizing and trying to live a life, a humane life that reclaims dignity from a job-centric society, and that is ultimately what brings everybody here as well, is that we are structurally stultified of our time energy, we are functionally illiterate, we are broken, we've been foreclosed on our horizon of possibilities from being able to discover or hone those talents under tutelage with copious amounts of time energy. And well, what is the reasons for that? What is the situation? Why is it that nobody has any plausible way forward to where we could have that? What is that? What's going on? We're more advanced than we've ever been as a species, as a civilization, and yet here we are. And so diagnosing the situation is a really big part of what's going on at Theory Underground, and getting everybody on the same page for 2025 is ultimately the goal. 2025 subscribers get access to everything, but especially ongoing lectures and seminars by yours truly, Benjamin Studebaker and Michael Downs, and guest lectures from Nina Power and potentially some other people, but stay tuned because we're trying to simplify, we're trying to essentialize, we're trying to streamline, and in doing so, we've come up with a sweet new way of juggling things, and that is putting a brand on every relationship that I have here at the core and calling it a podcast. And so we have Why Left with David McCarricker and Benjamin Studebaker. We have What's Right with David McCarricker and Ann Snellgrove McCarricker. And then we have Why Us with me and Nance. And then we have another secret podcast not to be announced until the new year. So stay tuned for that. But of course, if you've been trying to keep up with the M-Stews or M-Stewer Con in the full length version of that, right? Which includes the tours and the conference and the epic marathon streams and how it all fits together, and trying to follow out like the rationale as to who we bring on and what books and what's driving all of this. Well, I'll just sum it up like this. The conditions of possibility for having real conversations are lacking because real conversations follow from time spent in reflection. And we don't have time energy for reflection. And reflection on what? On the experiences spent trying to organize or read books or both, right? Well, we have to do the reading, we have to do the writing, and then we have to have the conversations. But the conversations without the reading and the writing are hollowed out simulations of conversations. We want to establish the conditions of possibility for conversations. And so before we open it up to the turn, I'll just say that the turn is one of these organizational concepts that cannot be understood without contradictions and tribunal zero. And so I'll let Mikey say something about Tribunal Zero here in a second, and I'll say contradiction is kind of like a bigger-brained version of a debate where it's not about the either side winning. It is instead about the person, the worker with earbuds, trying to understand the contradictions themselves. The only real winner from a successful contradiction is the person who's not in either camp represented, but is instead trying to understand how the contradiction constitutes the field that they are entering. There's a lot of theory that goes into that. There's a blog post on the topic. You can go find it at the Substack for Theory Underground. But Tribunal Zero, Mikey, if you are handy, otherwise I'll just give my own little butchered summary of it.
Well, the only issue, right? I'm at the coffee shop and it's kind of loud in here at the moment. I'm not going to be here much longer, so it might be better if you take this one right now.
And you're not going to be here much longer means you're not going to be at the coffee shop much longer, or in the call?
The coffee shop.
Does that mean that you will be able
to talk better?
And you will be a part of the turn?
Yeah.
Nance, cue the clapping. Everybody, that's the big secret. It's a surprise. I've been holding back all week. Sean didn't know. But yes, Mikey will be a part of this turn committee or panel or whatever we want to call it, which is very exciting.
I just want, look, I've told you, Dave, there will be no promises that I can make these on a regular basis, but I'm not missing Sean's.
Thank you. Perfect. Yeah. And you've been reading it for the last week, which is exciting.
Sean, your essay's killer. I love it.
That spoiler alert.
Dude. Thanks. That means a lot coming from you, Mikey.
Yeah. All right, guys. I'll just say a couple things about Tribunal Zero and then we'll get after it. So Tribunal Zero is a concept that Mikey comes up with in a recent piece on his Substack. And it's basically where he starts talking about how in the world of theory, and he picks on some of his favorites, like Slavoj Žižek. In the world of theory, it has become totally okay just to make assertions, just to advance an idea without an argument, where you assume a sympathetic audience rather than a critical audience, really, like an audience that wants you to make your case. And so that kind of, that the concept for Tribunal Zero is of, well, if you really want to make your case, imagine that you're making it to a room of 20 people, and those 20 people come from different areas of the theory scene or different areas of scholarly backgrounds, and you're having to make your case to people who are not Lacanians. They might hate you like Deleuzians supposedly do, right? Or you might you'll have some Marxists there, you'll have some Heideggerians there, you'll have some Nietzscheans there, you'll have some analytic philosophers there, you'll have some positivist science bros there. You'll have a good mixture of different kinds of people there. And if you're thinking about the piece that you're working on, like a great book someday, that great book you're going to write when you're 50 years old, well, then you should be thinking that you're writing it to Tribunal Zero, not to your homies, not to your former self, not to your parents, not to your academic general peer, not to your Facebook audience. No, you're writing it to Tribunal Zero. It's a way of making the whole process and your relationship to the big other one that's more generative. Okay. And so Tribunal Zero is not just an idea. Mikey's going to do it. He's said that he will be the first person to do it. This will be, instead of a proper dissertation committee, and it'll be like you all get to see him in his process of becoming by reading The Dangerous Maybe and seeing his appearances on Theory Underground over the last 5 years. And then you'll eventually get to see him with people like Todd McGowan and us and Chris Catrone. And I'm just throwing out names of people who've been involved recently who would probably say yes to being on Tribunal Zero. But the turn is kind of related. It's kind of like a miniature version of that. It's kind of like a miniature version of that at the same time that it's an opportunity for somebody who has been doing extraordinary work while working with earbuds, probably, to actually kind of get a seat at the table and have us all kind of converge on it. And so that's what we're here to do today. There's a bunch of other theory that goes into contradictions, Tribunal Zero and the turn, ways that this counters structural stultification, functional illiteracy, the post-class fractured mass, and hopefully lays the basis for T3 institutions. If you want that lecture, I did it last week, but now we're here and we're going to get after it shortly. And I thought it would have made sense for Mikey to probably be the first person, but if he's still at the coffee shop, then it probably doesn't make sense. And so I want to have a quick little conversation with you guys about what you think the proper order here would look like. Because I was kind of thinking it would be Mikey, Studebaker, Nance, me. That way there's some time between me talking. But you guys can talk about that, suggest your suggestions in the chat. I want to start with Sean. We know that we were going to start with Sean anyway. So Sean, what we want to have you do is share a little bit about the process of the last year, working on this piece. How did you get here? Tell everyone a little bit about how this idea came about and what your work-life balance has been as you got it together.
Oh, well, yeah, I don't even know how much I want to say about like why exactly I wrote this. More or less, all I really want to say is like I'm trying to understand the situation, and I felt like for whatever reason I felt like I had to write this. This is what it came out of, like I must write this, and like you might have read it. Some people might have read it and be like, why would you write something that's guaranteed to alienate your own audience, But I'm like, yeah, that's all it was. It was just like I have to write it. I don't whatever the consequences are, like whatever, So that's kind of where I'm coming from. It's like just, and then I was just reading Christopher Lasch, and I was reading all these other thinkers, and I'm just trying to synthesize something that like there's something there. I could tell there's something there, and I'm trying to bring out, the best of what I think is there. But yeah, I'm super excited to be here, and yeah, I just wanted to say too that like I think like a critique is high praise already. Like just the fact that you guys think that this is like even worth talking about is like awesome and like super flattering to me. So I'm like, you can't hurt me, So like do your worst. I'm here for that. I'm totally here for that. And like I think that the one's self-image needs to be sacrificed at the altar of one's self-overcoming is the way I like to think about it. So yeah, I'm super here for it. And if you rip it to shreds, I'm here for it, because like this is a moment and trying to, for all of us to try and come to understand the situation. That's what I care about more than anything, and of course I stand by like what I wrote, but like I'm here for it. You know what I mean? So
thanks,
yeah,
Sean.
I'm super pumped to be here, super excited to be here. And yeah.
That's actually probably, before we dive in, Benjamin, if you have anything you'd like to say on what I was gonna say it, but I think maybe you'd be better fit to say it because this was kind of one of your own things that you were wondering about going into this. The fact that you never had any supervisions with Sean, and I want people who are thinking about becoming subscribers and maybe eventually getting onto the turn with us to realize that normally there's a process of supervisions between them getting involved and this kind of an event. Could you maybe, and the supervision is like the biggest part that I left out in my opening statements. So what would you like to explain to people about the supervision process that Sean did not get?
Yeah, so my general kind of vision for this would be if you're taking courses with me, then for each of the topics, you have an opportunity to write a 2,000-word essay, which I then give extensive comments on in the margins through Google Sheets or Word. I give comments in the margins, and then we meet to discuss the paper for an hour, and we do that privately in a supervision. And then my thinking is that the turn would potentially be some of the sharpest or most interesting essays that come out of that. People would then be picked to be moved forward for this. And of course, because I will have supervised them a number of times prior to their being picked for this, I will have a sense for the dynamic and for what they can take and for how far they can be pushed. The great thing about Sean is that he's totally down for whatever it is that we do to him. So yeah. He is, I'm not worried about Sean. And, Sean's piece is a much longer piece than probably would be the standard piece that I would look to do for this, just because of how much, in terms of comments, I try to give per unit text when I do a supervision. And that's really the reason why the papers tend to be around 2K. If you go up to 15, it's just very, very difficult without spending the entire week on the paper to sustain that level of feedback. So those will be, some of the differences between this and then some of the later ones that I anticipate that we'll do.
Which will make the ones that we do later a lot easier to do in a sort of sense, because we'll all be able to hone in on the same 7 to 10 pages. We'll all be able to put a lot more thought into those 7 to 10 pages. Instead, what happened here was, I think we all put a lot more thought into the first 7 to 10 pages. And then eventually we're like, okay, so we just got to read the rest of it and kind of like ease off a little bit. And so I think, Sean, you'd asked for the version that's marked up with Benjamin's comments or my comments, or I think the way we were thinking about it is you'll just get that afterwards. So you can look at it. That way you're not coming into this kind of with like too much of an idea of what we're going to do, because also there's a lot of stuff that we might have written down that we decide not to bring in because we have priorities, each of us, in what we are going to address.
Yeah, typically speaking in a supervision, I would give you the comments at least an hour or so before to give you a chance to read through. But in this particular case, there was just so much that we tried to do. And we had to make compromises about how much we could get done leading up into the week. So I did, the kind of very thorough supervision style exegetical comments on maybe the first 8 pages or so. And then I had to cut it simply due to time energy constraint.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think if it's all right, guys, I'll just open up with a couple of general statements about this, and then specifically why I wanted to lead off with this one. And then Benjamin will kind of give you the floor, unless Mikey's able to be available by that time, but I think he's got to drive home. So I'm going to go ahead and...
If you want, I can always chime in here or there. I just don't want the background noise to be overly annoying.
Would you be able to step outside just for the part where you kind of explain to everybody the main thesis in terms of its intervention in the psychoanalytic scene?
It's freezing outside. And if I take it to the car, then I lose the Wi-Fi.
The background noise is fine. We're all fine with background noises. Doesn't matter.
Are you guys okay right now?
Yeah, it's totally fine.
Yeah.
So I'll just say,
I forgot to say one thing. I just had to shout out really quick. Andy from Hello Gorgeous. He helped me get, this was a steaming pile of shit really at one point, like unreadable at one point. So he helped me make something out of it, so I just had to mention him really quick.
Shout out to Andy. All right. So I'll begin with this. Theory Underground seems, from the outside standpoint, perhaps from the passing observer's standpoint, to have a lot of disparate threads, a lot of different ideas going on. But there is, as Nance said for the last 2 years, a directionality that holds all of them together. And recently we've been talking about what does it actually mean to say that this is because it's an emerging school of thought in process. Well, I want to just focus in on a couple of the threads that this piece so artfully bridges, and that is the world of psychoanalysis with the world of political theory. And not just political theory in general, other people are doing that, but something that could loosely be referred to as some kind of post-left political theory. When people want a critique of the left from the standpoint of the left, one of the places that a lot of folks went in 2020 was the work of Christopher Lasch. Very few people who remained on the left or just only consume left content, people who never went through a process of subjective destitution or disillusionment concerning the left, saw it and then just kind of wrote off Lasch as some kind of reactionary thinker. But of course, I think anyone here who knows of the work of Lasch is well aware that that is not the case. So bringing Christopher Lasch into dialogue with the applied psychoanalytic community here online, but also in the broader world, including the folks over at the LAC conference, is something that is very exciting, but also relevant to what we're doing at Theory Underground. Now, Mikey is our residential scholar, professor, thinker, book writer on the fault line theory of the internet, which is basically split between two approaches to libido, right? I mean, we can talk about the split in like 20 other ways that I've heard Mikey lay out, but as far as one of the essential contradictions that we'll be focusing on for the next month, libido is one of them. And we have two fundamentally different theories of libido between the CCRU and the Ljubljana School. Those were the two major schools of thought doing interesting stuff on the internet at the dawn of cyber history during the year that Benjamin Studebaker was born. Yeah, it's part of how the story goes, guys, and it's true too, which is interesting. So the fault line theory is kind of where we find ourselves, right? We find ourselves in relation to Slavoj Žižek and Nick Land, because we're on the internet. And if you're on the internet and people are into Deleuze, chances are they're into Deleuze because of the signal boosting that Deleuze got because of the successes of the CCRU. Or the same could be said of Hegel, Marx, and Lacan for the Ljubljana School, right? We could start adding other thinkers like Bataille and Nietzsche and the ways that these two schools have brought those guys in. We could start expanding that out. We can bring in their kind of critical interlocutors, you know, when people want like a non-vulgar Žižek, they go to Badiou. He's like the sterilized, proper, progressive version of Žižek, or, you know, he's got his communist cards in order and he doesn't say as many heretical things. But we understand
he also
things.
gets rid of death drive. That's
And he also-
the other appeal people like. Non-death drive Žižek.
Just take out all you want. It's like alcohol without the alcohol. It's like
Badiou is the diet caffeine-free Coke of Žižek's.
there you go. So what Benjamin's going to bring into this is his background in political theory. What I'm going to bring into this is that I'm a student of this fault line theory, and I've been trying to understand it through the work of Todd McGowan and Leon Brenner. Nance was there for the Leon Brenner course. He was there for the Seminar 11 course with Todd McGowan that we hosted this year, both of those courses. And Mikey's been teaching me about Žižek and Land ever since 2020, really. But what I'm also bringing in is socioanalysis, critical media theory, and time energy theory. Okay. And so this is a nice bridge. Now the question is like, is it a sturdy bridge? Can it hold the weight of the supplies that need to be brought across the bridge? Is it a nice scenic bridge for foot traffic, for bougie Whole Food shoppers who are just walking across a bridge? Or are we trying to drive like freight across that bridge? Like, how sturdy of a bridge between these two worlds is it? We're all going to kind of walk around and kick its sort of metaphorical tires, right? We're all going to kind of bring our resources to bear on it. And so, Mikey, if you really can talk from right, how about you just lay out some of the things that you love about it, but also can you just kind of like lay out the thesis? What is pathological narcissism, and how is it a contribution to the conversation that you guys are all having with Dwayne, Leon, Zizek, etc.?
Well, look, I mean, pathological narcissism is simply where there's something unhealthy about how you relate to your ego. Now, we could say that there's a kind of structural pathological narcissism insofar as the way we relate to our ego as such is pathological, because the ego for Lacan is the way that the infant starts to get a hold of itself, get its bearing in the world, but always on illusory grounds, because you don't have any real wholeness to your being. The baby is, fragmented, and it's on the basis of an illusory self-image, primarily that of seeing itself in the mirror, that it gains some sense of wholeness that it strives towards. And so, in a sense, the ego is an illusion, but it's also a necessary illusion. But we do end up, I mean, if you've ever seen footage of like chimpanzees or any of the other great apes in front of a mirror, they don't really pay their image in the mirror much attention at all. Unlike us, right? That just completely can fixate on it. But the way that we're talking here, it's not just this default thing with the ego. Pathological narcissism has to do with, at least the way I would articulate it, is a society in which your highest ideal is your own self, especially your self-image. And so this goes hand in hand with the basic structures of consumerism. Consumerism, as Baudrillard had, famously pointed out, is this system that tries to have you define yourselves in terms of the commodities you consume. This is where we latch on to commodities, because our commodities become the mechanisms through which we differentiate ourselves and individualize ourselves, have some sense of meaningful individuality in society. And of course, for Baudrillard, this is simulation. That just because you buy a certain commodity, it doesn't mean you have anything. If you buy a Che Guevara t-shirt, it says that you're a rebel. Do you actually have true rebellion in your heart? No, you don't have to. You just consume the shirt. And so this is this simulatory idea of how sign values connected to commodities, simulate identities that aren't necessarily representative of anything about the individual as a subject. Pathological narcissism has to do with this emphasis on constantly creating and recreating yourself, redefining yourself, and it is a focus on one's self as if that's the highest goal. Now, there's different ways to define it, but that's how I.
And then what do you want to say about the piece? You kind of, well.
Okay, so I'll just say, like, look, I don't have anything really negative to say about it. I think it's a great contribution to theory. This is one of these things where it's like, do I have criticisms of Deleuze's difference in repetition? I go, I mean, like to me, it's such a contribution to philosophy that, however I wrestle with it, like, okay, the only thing, The only thing I could say is that maybe the way, Sean, you use superego, I sit there and go, I wouldn't have done that, maybe. But this is all minutia, where it's like, yeah, I say that based on me working out my own concept, or re contextualizing and expanding Lacan and Zizek's concept to the point that I have stuff going on in my head when I hear superego that nobody else on this planet has. So it's not even fair, because my major thing that I've written on the superego I haven't even released. So it's just, there's little conceptual nuances with the superego that I see that I don't, that are my thing. But that's the only thing I was sitting there going, yeah, well, but that's it. Like, as far as everything else, I just see it as, making great connections, yeah, especially between Lash and Lacan. I think this is, I mean, Sean, you honestly could take this and turn it into a book. You could make further connections between Lacan and Lash if you wanted to, and expand it, right? So I just think what he does is it is this great way of thinking ego in terms of Lash and in terms of Lacan, that I think they both have a lot to give each other when it comes to thinking in terms of the imaginary. By the imaginary, I mean the register of the ego in this context.
I think the section
And
I
I
want
just
to,
got to think, can I just say my favorite thing about it, honestly? So look, I knew going in when I to this, I was like, okay, a lot of this is going to be familiar ground for me, because this is kind of the topics and the concepts that I live in, right? Sean, I think the point where you really shine as a theorist is your example of the Beyonce song versus the Erykah Badu song. I look for points like this where I'm like, okay, I've got a similar set of concepts that you have, but I would have never pulled off that example. Like that's where there's this incredible creative spark to be able to to apply the concepts to something like that. That was honestly, I mean, the highlight of the essay for me was that differentiation between those two styles of lyrics. I think you got something really original and insightful with that. And yeah, that was honestly my favorite part of it. And again, it's, for me, it's because if the concepts are concepts I'm on some level familiar with, I'm looking for, okay, but what do you do with them? And you did something really unique. I mean, honestly, you're a great example giver, and which is one of my favorite things that theorists can be, is to provide really great examples. And you have a great background familiarity with pop culture. I mean, this is an egoic identity, but I see myself in that, where I'm like, I'm always trying to pull from this wellspring of pop culture knowledge I have. And but you pulled off examples that were really, really good. And that, honestly, yeah, for real, that was my favorite part of it.
I want to say just a couple more points on the thesis before we turn it over here to Benjamin. And I want to focus on page 3 when he says, another way of phrasing the most essential definition of narcissism, right? What a great point to zone in or zoom in on, is that this narcissism is a psychic state wherein the libido is turned away from the outer world of objects and consequently inwards towards the ego, which tends to result secondarily in a megalomaniacal omnipotence of thought. This is because turning the libido inwards forces the creation of a self-image, which is invariably grandiose, since the pathological narcissist is attempting to protect a fragile, embattled ego, a minimal self, if you will, which is a play off of Lash's book by that name. I must emphasize that this self-image cannot be identical to the self, since the self is a moving target, something in flux. The pathological nature of narcissism lies there, in that confusion of the self-image with the self. It's a really, really good point. Narcissism is a protective essentialization of the self. I vaguely remember irritating my sisters when I was probably 8 years old while we were sitting on the couch watching the TV show Survivor. Every time someone failed in a physical challenge, I would say, I could have done that. Meanwhile, I couldn't even have reached from one monkey bar to the other, for instance. The narcissism of the child compensates him for his lack of true definition, his failure at that point, on having fully separated psychically from his parents, particularly from his parents' desire, the presence of which is inevitably traumatic. The child wants to be desperately what he perceives his parents want him to be. This imaginary gaze of the parent is extremely demanding. In psychoanalysis, for the imagined glance of the parent with which, it's like a typo, but anyway, yeah, with which the child perceives he is being observed is the ego ideal. Yeah, so whenever you hear us talking about the ego ideal, what we're talking about is that sort of like you want the respect, recognition of this gaze, right? That's the ego ideal. The child attempts to shield themselves from this perceived gaze, regardless of whether the parents' expectations are actual or only imagined. Either way, they are given force in the imagination. Through these illusions of omnipotence, impossible, exaggerated notions of autonomy, power, and freedom, narcissism is a form of protection from the gaze of the other and an attempt to force a premature separation between self and other. The separation has not yet been earned, secured in the psyche. In other words, the narcissistic subject has not managed to prove to themselves that they are independent, and in their insecurity over this fact, they imagine themselves as being so, in an exaggerated way. Now, what's missing is the tie-in to the no, and it's just a very important, all of the talk we've had so far leaves out the no and the PMC. And there's a relation between the no and the PMC that is the bridge between everything that has been set up until now and Lash. And basically, we live in a permissive culture now. Instead of just saying that, no, you cannot have that to a child, it has become customary, and this is kind of Sean's thesis, permissive parenting comes in and he uses some Barbara Ehrenreich at one point with the fear of falling, with the professional middle class's fear of falling. This permissive parenting is not just give kids whatever they want and never tell them no. It becomes a constant negotiation process. We could think of helicopter parenting, except with an ongoing conversation where everything is on the table, anything can be negotiated, right? There is no. You and your parents are constantly negotiating on everything. There's no final cutoff. So how do you move from the ego ideal to having a strong sort of superego? And the point with the superego in the way that Sean is using it here, which is a more traditional way of using it, not exactly the way Mikey writes about it. This more traditional way is just to say the superego says no, right? But when the superego in this sort of permissive family doesn't become secure because prohibition or castration or the no of the father is never really enforced and everything's up for a conversation, the nature of the superego changes. The superego no longer says no, and therefore you can no longer say no to yourself, right? In the successful story of how this all works out, your parents telling you no, it's traumatic, but eventually you learn. And then once you've learned to accept that castration, now you can apply the no in your own life. You say, oh my God, I'm going to go eat some pizza. No, I'm not. And you could tell yourself no, and you could follow through on that no. But if you didn't traverse this, you might not be able to tell yourself no. And everything about modern capitalism wants to tell you, be your own self, be your best self, consume. You have the right to everything, be everything, do everything. There is a sort of no holds barred approach for the ego. And that's the kind of thing I wanted to hone in on, is that no. And then, of course, the connection between Barbara Ehrenreich and Christopher Lasch there with the revolt of the elites and the minimal self and the culture of narcissism is just to say that this becomes ubiquitous in PMC spaces. And there's more that I would add, but I will save all of my thoughts until later. It's time for me to stop talking. Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I think that Sean definitely is talking about something that happens. I think we definitely see people who exhibit this kind of behavior. The question for me is how universal this is. There are a couple of ways that you could approach this, right? One would be to say, this is one of the things that happens. It's not necessarily all of the things that happens, but it's one of them. Another would be to try to say exactly how often it happens or how frequently it happens, or to make claims about that, right? The critique I would have from the point of view of political theory is that Sean doesn't consistently take a stance about how often it happens. There are points in the paper where he acts as if this is everything that happens in capitalism, that this has happened to the point where the symbolic order just can't be entered into at all, and that this is the experience that everybody gets. There are other points in the paper where he emphasizes that this is a PMC thing, that it's a professional class thing, which would therefore make it something which only a very distinctive part of the population experiences. I would want to also push a little further and say that I think that we can certainly identify professionals who have other kinds of issues apart from this, right? Some people have tiger moms who tell them no all the time. Some people are gifted kid honor students who get lots and lots of no's from their professional class parents. Certainly in my own life, I got plenty of no's. I had an engineer for a dad, I had a psychotherapist for a mom, and I got a ton of no. And I know a lot of other people who are professionals or have professional class parents who got no's, or who had parents who worked in corporate environments who got no's. I think that there's a question here about just how frequently this happens. And if Sean had kind of prefaced all of this with, this is one of the things that occurs, this is one of the pathologies that arises up out of capitalism. It's not the only one, but it's one of them. That would have been very persuasive. It also could have been interesting to try to develop a more precise case of how frequently it occurs, but that would have been difficult and would have required more. So that's the main critique I have, is that there's a tendency in the piece to think of society as one unitary thing, which has kind of one experience. But there's clearly a lot of variety in family structure. There's clearly a lot of variety in some of the other things that go on. Something I very much like about it is the emphasis on corporations. I think a lot of contemporary theory tends to downplay and avoid corporations, in large part because theory is produced by academics who are in a university setting, and they don't really want to apply what they do directly to their own workplace for various reasons. And so there's a tendency to stay off of the corporation, criticize the family, criticize the church, but not the corporation that actually pays you. Or if you do that in a highly idealized way where you try to celebrate workplace democracy or something while doing nothing to actually achieve that within your own institution in any meaningful sense. So I like the emphasis on corporations. I think that more of that is a good thing. But I do think the weird thing is that actually what you get very little of in this piece is the family. The family is the thing that's kind of downplayed because the family would be what would introduce variety within the professional class, right? The reason that some professionals would end up pathological narcissists and others would have other kinds of problems and issues would be to do with different family structures, I would think. Or perhaps it would have to do with other things. Maybe there are still certain kinds of bureaucracies that are more functional than others. Maybe there's a variety in terms of types of bureaucratic structure. Maybe there are certain kinds of bureaucratic structures that territorialize while others deterritorialize. So there are some that are more libidinal and others that are more, functionally conservative. There are certainly conservative professionals and institutions that can be framed as having a conserving effect. So that would be my bone to pick with it, is that it doesn't really admit of very much pluralism, at least not explicitly. And I do think it raises this question of just how common is this? But as for, is this something that happens that Sean has clearly described? Yes. Sean has clearly described something that does indeed happen. And I think that that's a huge achievement in its own right. The further claims about how common it is in society, these are things that he doesn't even necessarily have to do. One way of approaching this would just be to go, let's talk about one of the things that happens and not make claims about how common it is. And I do think that that's a huge achievement in its own right. The further claims about how common it is in society, these are things that he doesn't even necessarily have to do. One way of approaching this would just be to go, let's talk about one of the things that happens and not make claims about how common it is. And it would be an enormous contribution as just one of the things that happens. But when you make these more ambitious claims about how universally it applies, these ambitious claims can set off responses in various kinds of readers that can cause them to miss the contribution of, well, regardless of how often it happens or how universal this is, it is one of the things that takes place. One of the things that clearly takes place is that some people don't get a no and don't know how to apply the no. That is definitely something that happens. But as for how common it is, and that's where I would really want to ask this question, because if I thought that it was the experience of the professionals, but not of everybody, I wouldn't push this as hard as I'm pushing it. I think it's not even the experience of all of the professionals. I think it's one of the experiences, disproportionately common among professionals, but also, and this is something Keir might have something to say about, I think it does happen among non-professionals too. Some, not all of them, but some. And so then it becomes very tricky. How do you sort out when someone will become a pathological narcissist versus not? Is there a way of trying to account for that in terms of social structures, family structures? And this is how you could grow this into if you actually try to drill down, when does this occur versus when does it not? As opposed to suggesting that capitalism or professional corporate institutions universally do this. Once you are drilling down when it happens versus when it doesn't happen, now you have something that can be used to try to produce institutions that are in some way robust and can withstand this tendency. You can identify and critique specific institutions for being more given to this than others. But the only way you can do this is to acknowledge that it doesn't happen to absolutely everybody, either in society or in the professional class. It's one of the things that happens. That would be my principal push.
Nance, you're up.
So, Sean, thank you for sharing this with us and everyone here. Thank you for coming along. This is a big moment. A lot of things have happened to make this come about, and it's an instrumental moment. I was going to say a pivotal moment, but I don't necessarily like the connotations of the word pivotal, but it's a big moment. So thank you. I think I love the piece. I think my initial thing was like, oh, it's not postmodern enough, and I think Dave might have said something similar. The one thing that kind of jumped out at me and stuck with me, like as I was reading, a question would kind of emerge, and then a lot of the time you answered that question via the text, and I was like, okay, cool. But the one thing that I kept coming back to was your framing, and I love your framing, and I think I know why you chose it. You chose Devo, because they're like a based punk band that gets misrecognized as like some pop bullshit, but Devo's actually dope. But the fact that you chose Devo led you to frame all of this as a devolution. The kind of the symbolic and the social order and all these things are devolving. And I think that's a dangerous idea. Because you necessarily include this teleology, you necessarily include the idea that with an evolution, things are moving toward the proper, the correct, the moral, even destination. And when it's devolving, it implies a regression or degrading, which I do think there has been regression and degradation. But framing it as a devolution kind of internalizes neoliberalism itself, and it kind of it takes the what was it, Benjamin, the critique of the Whig theory of history. I don't know. You said it better than I said it when you told me what I was trying to say.
Yeah. So Nance is talking about kind of devolution and Whig theories of history. So on the devolution point, Nance was arguing that when you devolve something, there's a juridical aspect to that. So when you devolve, you pass power down to a level beneath, right? It's not a term that's commonly used, but in the British political system, it gets used a lot to discuss, say, devolving powers from the UK Parliament to the Scottish Parliament or to local governments, right? So when you use a term like devolve, in that juridical sense, it potentially means that the power passes from these social structures to some other unit below. But because the some other unit below doesn't get discussed, there's a question of, well, where does then the structuring power go? And there are points in the paper where it seems to be suggested that the power just disappears, that it's just gone, that it just doesn't go anywhere. And therefore, we don't enter into the symbolic order. But I think that Nance's push would be it does go somewhere. And that would perhaps be to the family in many cases, or to maybe other kinds of institutions or structures that might exist that might nonetheless perform this role for some people to some degrees, even as these other structures or institutions lose the capacity to perform that role. The other point that Nance raised about Whig theories of history. So a Whig theory of history is a theory of history which implies a kind of progress, regress. So you can read something as either radical or reactionary, as either forward or backward, progress or regress. And if you look at, say, the work of 19th century liberal historians, this will be very much the character of the work. It will kind of assume progress, regress, radical reaction, forward, backward, as a way of evaluating history in this kind of binarized way of moving toward or away from a target or a goal or a teleological end state. And maybe they keep that teleological end state open-ended, a kind of freedom which is constantly in development, but there's still a directionality to it. Those kinds of theories of history have often come under criticism from postmodernists in the 20th century and more recently for being too unidirectional and for understanding reason or understanding human values in too narrow a way, not admitting a wide enough variety of different possible paths. So I think in reference to your paper, Nance's point on this would be that you at points criticize this kind of progress narrative, but in framing what's going on as a devolution or as a regression, you kind of take the opposite side of something which is still perhaps within a Whig framework and hasn't escaped that framework. Now, whether you should be trying to escape the Whig framework, I would leave open, because really what a Whig theory of history is it's modernism as applied to history as a discipline. And whether you should be a modernist or a postmodernist or some combination and exactly what, I think that's an open question. But there is this possible push, and you would certainly get it in the academy, that what you're doing is too modernist and not postmodern enough.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Nance, is that what you got?
Yeah, I think that was it. I mean, there's so much that this is a weird format. I've not done this, so I'm still trying to understand this. I mean, I could definitely pick Sean's brain.
I would say before we'll all kind of open it up to Sean will be able to kind of have a conversation with us after this segment. But for right now, I want to give you a moment more while I run around and do something right before I go to say some more things about these 30 pages. Like
it was 29, I think, not 30.
Okay. Yeah. So what I just want to hear a little bit more about, like, what you liked. And maybe some of the thesis points that we've not stressed enough, or other things that he accomplishes here. Oh no, Mikey's gone. It messed up my whole format. Mikey, you messed up the whole format, fucker. Okay, I'll fix it.
Hey, that's not nice.
What did you do? How did you disappear but mess it up? Oh, there you're back.
Laptop?
I had to get on my phone now.
Okay, it's fixed. The layout is fixed. All right.
I really enjoyed when you cited California Uber Alice. I think Jello deserves to be in more like academic or collegiate papers or whatever. So that was really cool. And I also had questions about it didn't seem to me that there was enough like of a critical media theory approach. Like there's a lot of this permissiveness that kind of seems to come from like an embodied subject of enunciation, but I don't know how much like talking about the fact that the structure of the world that we live in is also this permissive structure in the form of like, even if I were prohibited from doing a thing, I could go onto my device and have instant, always on, immediate access to it. So like it's less of like a language game, and it's even less of like a family structure thing, and it's more of like an embodied subject interfacing with the world. Like the world we live in is itself permissive and does this kind of injunction to go and do and be and consume and identify with the reflection of yourself that you see in the consumption and in the doing of the acts. And it's there. I think the only thing for me is I would have probably spent more time focusing on that, like the infrastructure, the material side of it, and probably, I mean, obviously, I don't know as much Lacan, and like I haven't spent as much time with this as you have. But that's not to say it's not there, and that's not to say I think you necessarily missed it. I just think maybe I would shift the focus of that permissiveness to like the infrastructure and the material world that we're actually in. But I don't know. I think it was great, man. Like you did a great job of taking examples that, like, I don't know the Katy Perry song and the Beyonce song and the other, like, I don't know those cultural objects, but I was able to relate to them, like the way you kind of expounded on and the way you set up the example and allowed it to kind of show itself. You did a great job. I think I probably would have struggled to be as clear if I were to take up writing a piece this long.
Thank you, Nance.
Oh, real quick, before we move on, there's one other thing I forgot to mention, which is this question about neoliberalism and whether this is a phenomenon of neoliberalism or of capitalism in general. At points in the piece, it was not clear to me how you were using the term neoliberalism. It usually refers to a period of capitalism, and therefore it has to have a beginning. And there's a question about whether it has ended or is going to end, right? And that it's usually identified with certain kind of features of the system. And in this piece, that term was kind of taken for granted. It wasn't totally clear when it begins. And there were points in the piece which suggested it might begin at different stages. Insofar as this has a lot of indebted to Lasch, a lot of Lasch's work occurs at a time when it's not totally clear neoliberalism is really the thing that we're talking about yet. We might just be talking about post-war capitalism. We might be talking about boomer subjects coming out of the 60s and who, for Lasch, have not properly entered into adulthood because they have received a particular kind of parenting that was perhaps common in that time or relatively common in that time. It could even be a critique of a previous generation and perhaps at this point, less applicable than it would have been in the 70s when Lasch was making the case. There's a question there about, is this kind of parenting becoming, or is this kind of being raised by corporations and by market structures, this kind of yes, is it becoming more common or less common historically? Lasch writes this stuff 40, 50 years ago. So I do think there's a question here about, is this more common, less common, or still relevant as one of the things that goes on? What I lean toward is still relevant as one of the things that goes on. That would be my impulse. But certainly you could argue it in different directions with regard to that. The real anti-Laschians will say this is a critique specifically of the 60s generation. Those are the people who are really, really anti-Lasch will push it that way.
All right. I'm going to do my best to not be pedantic and hone in on little things here and there and try to zoom in on what I take to be an essential set of problems. And I think that I can, in the most broad way possible, problematize this piece by talking about its form and its content, and that is to say the voice of its author or the subject of enunciation versus the disembodied narrator voice that you are challenging in the opening paragraph. And so for that reason, I will read the first paragraph. Now, first there's the quote. It is a Devo cover. It goes, "When I'm watching my TV and a man comes on to tell me how white my shirts could be, but he can't be a man because he does not smoke the same cigarettes as me, I can't get no satisfaction." And then it opens with, in Katy Perry's Dark Horse, we find out that the narrator is capable of anything, compares herself to Aphrodite, describes herself as a perfect storm, a bird without a cage, and magical. This type of indefinite narrator, who is nonetheless omnipotent and transcendent, did not emerge in popular music until after around 2008. It is not simply a coincidence that the narrator emerges after a great material economic change, the 2007 to 2008 real estate crash, in which millions of dreams and existential horizons were suddenly shattered by international market caprices. Several of the most popular songs of the period, which I will come back to later, actually come out of the period from 2008 to 2010, an extended period of suffering for all those millions affected. If music is popular to any extent because it is relatable, then what has changed in the culture such that we now have a desire to relate with such a disembodied narrator as in Dark Horse? The reasons for this are uncovered decades ago in a societal trend that has only been growing. That is, the advent of neoliberalism only intensified what has already begun, the stifling growth of bureaucracy. That is, the invasive species of the impersonal human institution into every aspect of human life. Christopher Lash's 1979, The Culture of Narcissism, is at least as relevant today as it was when he wrote it. It describes a basic condition which still obtains, that our social fabric has essentially degraded beyond repair, its terrain encroached on by an unstoppable growth, and the result has been a false individualism, a paradoxically collectivist grandiosity of the individual ego. Even though the forms of bureaucracy are somewhat different now than the forms which Lash criticized, the effects of these institutions are nonetheless similar in psychic life. And then it goes on. I want to point out key adjectives such as indefinite and disembodied, which are very crucial here. Indefinite, disembodied, and omnipotent, meaning all-knowing. Also transcendent, literally outside of the picture. Is this not the voice of the narrator itself throughout this entire piece? Speaking in absolute terms, telling us everything that is going on at its most essential level, saying everyone is going through this thing. Let me tell you about it. It is this way. It works this way. It works that way. This is what's going on. This, someone says this, but actually this. This, but that. This works this way. This works that way. It's a, hey guys, I've been to the top of Mount Sinai. I have the tablets. Here's what they say. Kind of voice. Now, it could have been an accident, but judging by your face, I'm going to say it is not an accident. It might be an accident, actually. So, I mean, if it was on purpose, then it's clever, but also you would have to kind of say that you're aware. And if you're not aware and it was an accident, then I would ask you in future things that you write to consider thinking about that right there, right? A lot of times you can read somebody writing about society and then you have to go, is that something that's going on with society or something that's going on with the person who's trying to think about society? Are you struggling with pathological narcissism? You say everyone is. You say everyone is. But that would, of course, mean you are. But there might be people in our lives who aren't at all. And so if there are people in our lives who are not at all, but you know for a fact it's happening with you, then there's a line between you and everyone else, and there's a big gray area. And the questions that Benjamin was bringing up about how far does this diagnosis actually apply to all institutions or all professional class people, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of epistemological questions come up. But the reason these kinds of epistemological questions matter for us here is because we, as workers with earbuds trying to do theory on our free time, have to essentially, as Nance and I have been talking about in our Why Us, formerly called the Self-Legitimating Johnson's podcast, have been talking about, essentially, we got to find a way to put our dick on the table and say, oh, excuse me, never mind, but how about this? Right? And now, of course, that's vulgar, it's crude, it's self-undermining to even say it, but also intellectuals tend to be aware, a little self-aware about the fact that they're taking up space. In fact, it gets to the point where it's overbearing how self-aware they are. We call this reflexivity. In its most obnoxious forms, it's very performative. Performative reflexivity, there's not an ounce of that in this piece. In fact, I would say that if there is a tendency, it is the exact opposite of a performative reflexivity. It is instead a performance of the indefinite, omnipotent, and transcendent narrator. The pathological narcissist is not in reference to a milieu. The pathological narcissist is only in reference to himself. And it's not his real self, it's an image of himself, right? Well, the milieu that this is relevant in, the constellation of ideas, thinkers, texts that this is intervening in, is absolutely essential, but often left out. Time energy, the concept, and my book come in for a brief moment towards the end. Critical media theory comes up in a line, as an item in a list of things that you can think about while watching a show, Trailer Park Boys, right? But there is no demonstration of an intimacy with critical media theory or time energy. And this is where I would bring in the post-class fractured mass, which I think that this piece is probably most relevant to me and my own thought and Nance and everything we've been doing for the last 2 years. At that level, the PCFM. The PCFM, as we've explained it so far, there's a lot more coming, but it's a combination of different insights from different theorists, Marx, McLuhan, Baudrillard, right? Especially. And it's about the horizon of possibilities where we start as embodied people. And then you work down into the relations of production. This is where we can talk about the PMC and the working class. But then beneath the relations of production is the mode of production itself that makes it so that we don't have time energy. Well, something happened in 1992, and it wasn't just Benjamin Studebaker being born. It was the advent of cyber history, right? History really did come to a close, but cyber history started in 1992. Now we are here on the internet. Who are we? Well, there's a big question about the word we. How expansive is that we? But let's zoom in on the subject of enunciation. A worker with earbuds. Where is he in this? Where is the former punk who listened to this music and maybe still does nostalgically? Where is he in all of this? What is his desire and drive? What is his field of possibilities? And how could he have talked about it without being obnoxiously, performatively reflexive? This is ultimately one of the big questions for socioanalysis. This is ultimately the kinds of questions that I've been asking over the last few months, especially as I've been teaching Sociology 101, critical social theory, and really diving into the question of legitimacy with Nance. But what I want to point out is that whether you're trying to speak to workers or trying to speak to professionals within the institutions or in the outstitutions, in either case, coming across like an indefinite, all-knowing, transcendent, disembodied narrator making indefinite, like concluding like prescriptions and diagnoses about all of society and everybody in it, it's self-undermining in both spaces. There's a way that if you do it within academia, you'll get thrown out. But also if you do that with a worker who doesn't already agree with you, they're going to say, oh, that's your opinion, man. This is what Nance and I are combating with our Why Us series and why we're bringing Bourdieu's classification struggles in. It's this question of like, who am I to speak? Who am I to make this pronouncement? There is some degree of authority that can be brought to the table just from your own standpoint. But there's a way of bringing your own standpoint to the table and acting like it has the last word that at the same time undermines your authority or your legitimacy. So I would say, like, as far as you have a laser focus and you have a task for this piece, and I think that you accomplish it. Now, I say I think you accomplish it, but my big question on my feedback to you starts with, what's the purpose of this piece? Who is its audience? Because I don't think any of us can give you valuable feedback unless we know the answer to that question. Otherwise, we're going to judge it using our own criteria from our own sort of wheelhouses. But if your task that you've set yourself to here, or that you feel compelled to follow through on, if your task is not my task, then I should be a little bit more selective about what criteria I use to judge you. But from the standpoint of someone who is deeply invested in taking the theory scene into a milieu and developing a school of thought, there is a constellation of problems, questions, concepts, thinkers, and texts that we all can relate to. And so that interventions into the milieu have to kind of like, instead of doing this sort of disembodied thing, also have to kind of, I mean, part of it might even be like saying that you learned something in a course, or you have a problem with something that came up in one of these courses. Finding a way to be able to actually bring that in. So for instance, Leon Brenner taught a whole course at Theory Underground on the clinical structures of psychoanalysis. This is, if anything, an intervention in that entire field. And of course, you were on the panel with Brenner, Dwayne, Mark, Mikey, Todd. And the point of having you there is because the conversations you've had with Mikey up until that point, as well as like as much as of your work as we had seen, led us to the conclusion that you are making a genuine contribution to that conversation. But if you pay attention to really great works of philosophy, part of how they often establish authority without saying, hey, look at me, I know what I'm talking about, and this is who I am, so you should listen to me. Instead, that's done in a more subliminal, kind of subtextual way by saying, there's this debate that's happening right now. Let me name some names. Let me name some works. Let me refer to a course. Let me say how these different people have different positions. And then I'm going to come in and say, what you guys are missing is this. Really a simple paragraph can be all it takes to sort of lay out the field that you're intervening in. And then you can kind of call back to it from time to time. So I think that kind of like taking it from disembodied narrator in a scene to, or like isolated thinker in the mountain, to, hey, actually, I'm in a world with other people. Those other people are thinking about these ideas. I've been thinking about their approach to these ideas. I think that what they miss is this. And that's also where you can just straight up say, all y'all are a bunch of Democrats functionally. You might call yourselves Marxists, but you guys are like basically just Democrats. You guys are not thinking about Christopher Lasch. You need to. Like, you could actually, as a worker, say, I think what you guys are missing is this. And you could actually just say, like, as a person between these two worlds, right? Now, I'm using that as an example. I'm not saying how you should write. I don't have any opinion about how you could actually pull it off. I'm just giving an example. Don't get lost in the example. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. It could have been more critical media theory pilled. It could have been more PMC pilled. For instance, one of the big things that we try to drive home, Elton and I, when we taught that course, is that there's a big difference between thinking about the PMC in workerist terms versus thinking about the PMC in sort of just, I'm just talking about the cultural currents and why this matters in the relations of production and kind of what that does to our horizon of possibilities and what it has to do with the mode of production. Bring it back to that. The reason that I say it that way is because it brings us back to the Michael Brook quote that I think I clipped from his conversation with Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. back in 2019. I put it on the channel. I added it to the PMC course playlist because it is actually that essential. And in that, he says that there's a difference between being PMC and being in the mode of the PMC. My piece brings in discursive Taylorism as the mode of the PMC. It's something that makes sense when we're talking about quantum mechanics and engineering, and it doesn't make sense when it comes to talking about cultural products. The humanities and social sciences falling prey to discursive Taylorism is extremely repellent to everybody else in the working class, except for the people who subscribe to X, Y, or Z influencers who are doing it the right way, right? Okay, so it's about and this would actually kind of, that kind of awareness, which you might already have, but it's not demonstrated in this piece. That kind of awareness kind of gets out ahead of what Benjamin was saying about how, well, you know, I'm professional class, but my parents said no to me. And the point is you can be of a class. No, you can be in a class, but not of a class. And also that the cultural norms, tendencies, and average everydayness of the PMC saturates all human life in America. This would be the stronger claim that I think you want to make, that Barbara Ehrenreich helps you make when she says that the professional middle class is the class that doesn't want to think of itself as a class, but it writes all the news and it makes all the movies, and it does it all from the standpoint of assuming its way of life to be normal. And so this becomes a big question about normalcy. I have some other points that I would like to bring up. There are ways that I think this could be developed that is kind of cognizant of things like field and habitus and the break between symbolic capital versus pseudo recognition and sign value. But these are kind of cutting edge conversations we're having on the back end here at TU. I don't want the public to be privy to them just yet. There's a lot of stuff we have on the back end that is still in process, and we're not going to roll it out. But I also wanted to kind of, before we go to the second round here, which in the second round, Mikey, Nance, and Benjamin all get to kind of respond to what we've all said so far, and then we'll open it up as a conversation with you. But there's a couple points. On the milieu point, you at one point, I'm trying to find the exact place here. Let's see. You say something that's Heideggerian, but you don't cite Heidegger. On page 17, you say, are you being authentic? Are you being your authentic self as an expression of something like your existential ontological ownmost possibility for being? Or are you participating in the capitalist murder of the term authenticity by curating a narcissistic image of yourself? This is not the place to fully uncover what is substantial behind the notion of authenticity, but it can only lie in the cultural expression of the primordial self-same kernel of the self that exists prior to culture. Whoa! That is such a huge and heavy claim, and it's so important. But the only citation there is for Kevin Mitchell, Innate, how the wiring of our brain shapes who we are. I don't think he talks like existential ontological onmos potentiality for being. That is Heideggerian mumbo jumbo right there, if I've ever heard it. And that jargon of authenticity that Adorno critiques is also something I did bring up in the Being in Time course that you took. And it's an interesting sort of question and problem. And even I think at one point you were critiquing Heidegger because you thought he was saying one thing, and I was like, I don't think he's saying that. And then on the second half of that course, I really bring in what I think he's doing, which is not what the Blatnerian, Dreyfusian approach to authenticity, which is liberal, does at all, right? Of course, that would have made this 40 pages instead of 30 pages. And so maybe you could have just left it out, or a short footnote that says, this is a can of worms that gets opened up by the Being in Time course. I can't get into it right now, but X, Y, and Z things have come up. Eventually, maybe I'll write about it. But I'm using this as an example because this kind of thing happens throughout. And these kind of like drive-by shootings of certain hot takes or usages of certain kinds of language is something that I think feels good when we're doing it. But then we have to probably come back and make slight editorial changes to later. So that it's, well, there's a lot of reasons why. Last thing I wanted to touch on is I think that I wanted to close on a positive, like probably my favorite thing about this whole piece. The bridge itself is probably my favorite. This functions as a reference point in the constellation, of different reference points that help us orient ourselves here at the milieu when we're thinking about bringing these worlds together. It does a really good job of that. I think it would have benefited from being in more dialogue with my piece on discursive Taylorism as the mode of the PMC. I think there's something special that could come from kind of bringing those two pieces into conversation. I think there's something special that could have come from bringing this into conversation with Mikey's Wage, Labor, and Jouissance. I think that Mikey's Wage, Labor, and Jouissance is actually a great way of sort of bridging the personal standpoint and the intervention in the theory scene, right? Like using the concepts and a little bit of stuff from your own life so that people don't think that you're disembodied and transcendent. But with all such things said, my absolute favorite part of this whole thing is like a passing moment where I actually thought for a second you were just being edgy, and then I had to sit there and really go over it. It's page 10. And let's see if I can find page 9, because obviously page 9 is what leads into page 10. And let's see. Do I have it here? No, I don't. Where the hell is it? Yeah. I'm holding it. I'm missing page 9. Okay, whatever. It doesn't matter. I don't need page 9. Page 10 has it all. At the very top, you say they exist as an abstraction, as a projection of whatever it is we would like them to be, much like the Jews did. And we're talking about people in society today. So you're saying people in society exist as an abstraction. You're talking about our neighbors. You're saying our neighbors exist as an abstraction. Oh, did we lose Mikey? Let me just change the layout really quick, and then I'll read it. Yeah, here we go. Mikey, you fucked everything up again. Hold on. I don't just have a basic display capture. Don't worry. I know exactly what I'm saying right now. I can come back to it. You know what? I'm going to leave the screen messed up and just finish what I'm saying. Everybody, you can just deal with it. Okay. So it goes, society exists as an abstraction, or like the neighbors are the people in the neighborhood. Like this is on the previous page, the page I can't find, the part that I wanted to read. You say, actually, Nance, do you have it in front of you? I actually think you should read leading up to this moment, since I can't find it.
Yeah. What? Hold on a second.
Bottom of page 9.
Shit, where the fuck is page 9?
That's what I'm saying. talk about form meeting content. Everything's all fractured here on the screen. People can't really. It's like people could see Kier and Evan and Jacob and David, but not not us. Yeah, it's all fractured.
That's wonderful.
Not Sean at all.
No Sean. He's disembodied. There is no Sean.
Sean did not take place.
Okay, he's back.
Where we start? The narcissistic identity is the presence.
Yeah.
The narcissistic identity is the presence toward being complete, of having no lack, of thereby being in no way emotionally or symbolically vulnerable, needing absolutely nothing from others. In other words, the narcissistic identity is a castration defense, a denial of one's inherent dependence on other people and, in general, an avoidance of the fact of the contingent fragility of life. What makes this possible in our post-modern world is that many, in fact, do not seem to need other people for virtually anything. We can seemingly get everything we need delivered to our door by a series of international conglomerates, going from manufacturers in East Asia to Pacific shipping magnates to grand national distributors, so that we never have to go ask anything at all from our neighbor. Neither does our neighbor need to entertain us, deliberate with us, or even simply be polite. We can get virtually anything from the corporate other. So who needs the cultural other? That's based corporate other. That's sick as fuck.
Mm-hmm.
Our neighbor might as well not exist. And in such a world, we will find loving our neighbor or even hating them as neighbor to be a rather difficult task.
There we go.
They exist.
They exist as an abstraction, as a projection of whatever it is we would like them to be, much like the Jews did as they lived in a separate world from the Germans prior to the horrors of the Holocaust and became, from the German perspective, simply vessels on which to project their fears and anxieties. The difference now is that regardless of religion, race, ethnicity, creed, lifestyle, sex, or gender, everyone is a Jew. Suspicion and fear reign absolutely, and so we invite surveillance and control into our own neighborhoods. All are divided against all. And of course, because I was multitasking and I was listening to this with a robot reader the first time when I heard this, I was kind of just like, and then I heard you say, everyone is a Jew. Suspicion and fear reign absolutely. And so that's where I came in and I was just like, are you saying that Jews reign with suspicion and fear, and so they invite surveillance and control into their own neighborhoods, and now we're all Jews? And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? And I instantly went and found the paper, and I sat there and I read it, and I was like, oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. You're saying we're all in the position of being projected on by our neighbors, by our family members, by our friends, by people online. We're all in a position of being projected upon and being the sort of screen for them to project their fears, right? And that's why everybody invites in surveillance and control into their own neighborhoods. And so all are divided against all. This is that post-class fractured mass kind of tie-in. That's kind of what we're all getting at. There's a whole thing about gerrymandering Befindlichkeit that I would love to eventually see, or maybe I need to write that piece, bring it into relation with all of this. But for now, I just wanted to say that this point about how we all become this sort of I don't need a neighbor. I don't actually need a real neighbor. I have the corporate other. I can just live in my bedroom and keep ordering Amazon packages to arrive, and I never actually have to see anybody. And now you have this Zoomer discourse about how it's so hard to go to a store to get something and see a person or make a phone call. And this is like a building sort of thing, and it gets at what you're talking about with this culture of isolation and loneliness. And right here you said basically suspicion. Right? A culture of paranoia. This is also where we can bring in the sort of post-trust era that we are in. So I love it. I think that's a really important point. But ultimately, if what you're doing is an intervention in the psychoanalytic community or the political theory scene, this is an opportunity for us to seriously engage with your work, which means in part recognition, like praise, but also real recognition can kind of see where you're coming from and see it kind of also intervene back. And so my main intervention back is just to say that we have a lot of people at Theory Underground who are fellow travelers and members who, because of flaws of the system, because of flaws with my own teaching, because of also just the PCFM being what it is, it becomes really easy to be here for a year or two and kind of project onto us and think you know what we're getting at, and you think you know what we're doing with critical media theory and the PMC and time energy theory. And then you write an awesome treatise, and then we read through it and we're like, the main thing we're doing here is not here, but it is referenced. And I do find that to be a common thing. And it's part of what goes on in a scene where you have a lot of different people in the scene, but like you are writing what you can't not write. You have your work life and your writing life. And outside of that, maybe you have a little bit more of a life doing other things. But I think that there's a lot of people working on, they've got a baby that they are giving, like they are in labor right now. It's like Mikey with Ghost. Sorry. God damn it. I can't believe that happened.
You can't say that, dude. Everybody forget that word.
It's like Mikey with his main, it's like Mikey with his baby. We can't talk about it. Anyway, it's what he is slaving away on. And when he's slaving away, he can't necessarily keep up with all the courses going on, right? And so ultimately, I think that this is a perfect sort of start to the turn, because it's the first piece, and it also might be the last piece here at the turn, that is something that happened so in depth and is so based in so much of the same kind of questions and problems, yet kind of out of the loop on certain fundamental concepts that we're working on here when it comes to like the school of thought itself. Okay. That's it, man. But I think it's amazing. And whether it turns into a book, or if before you get to the point where it could be a book, you need to first break it into 5 distinct 2,000 word pieces that could actually be up for supervision. And then you actually work on, there's a piece in here about punk versus pop, rockabilly. You can bring in the bratty, sassy, whiny pop punk versus like some kind of punk that you think had something going for it, right? There's that whole thing going on. That's a paper, right? There's a piece here on Lash and what people are missing in psychoanalysis. That's a paper. There's a piece here on the clinical structures that engages with Todd and Dwayne and everyone. That's a paper. So there's a bunch of papers that could be focused 2,000 word pieces. And then ultimately there's a book. So yeah, great work, man. Everybody, we will be right back for round 2 right after this. Free and public work at TU by becoming a patron over at Patreon.
But if you would like to get involved and become a member at Theory Underground so that you can listen to special content that is not accessible to anyone else, or if you go up a subscriber level, actually join in the discussions, or at the top level, have us actually read your work, giving constructive feedback, and ultimately paving a way to potentially being a part of what we call the turn, then you'll want to become a subscriber. That's how you will access the ongoing courses and seminars. We've brought together Benjamin Studebaker's experience in political theory and science and philosophy with my critical social theory, phenomenology, existentialism, critique of political economy, critical media theory approach, combined with Michael Downes's fault line theory, the CCRU versus Ljubljana School, or Žižek versus Land. And of course, how he brings those against one another and then transcends them through other thinkers like Baudrillard, who he'll be teaching an intro course to in 2025. All of us are teaching stuff in 2025 that rhymes or argues or goes together. And so the best way to accelerate your development getting into theory right now is to just become a subscriber at TU. Just go to the website, click get involved, and I'm gonna look, what I'm about to play for you all is a really special moment from our documentary that we're working on, an interview where Benjamin explains why he's supporting Theory Underground and getting involved as a active member here at the core of the teaching team.
Yeah, so the thing that I notice is that a lot of people criticize the university, they criticize the left, they don't build an alternative institution. They will go, the university sucks, but you know what's great? Substack and Patreon and YouTube, and they'll lean into that. But that is a negation, right? You guys don't do that. You guys are interested in sublating the university within the newly emergent media. Or you could frame it the other way, sublating the newly emergent media within the university, right? And so this, of course, will ultimately lead, if you take it where it goes, to a question of institutions and having actual economic, social role possibilities for theorists. This is the critical crisis, which is that there are still some very bright, very well-educated people, but they are not able to replace themselves. And because most of them have university positions, their level of interest in replacing themselves is to some degree compromised.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry that much about themselves. They don't have that much stake in it because they're already set up. However, because you aren't in the underground, you have some potential of being able to actually create an institution or structure which makes it possible for people to do theory in the future. This is something that, as far as I can tell, only you are doing. The thing about freeing Mikey from wage labor, this idea not only that your channel would free you from the Amazon job, but that this could grow in such a way that it could provide spaces for multiple people, and then those multiple people could interact in the way that they would in a monastery or in a university department. This is the revolutionary idea in terms of raising consciousness and making it possible for us to think in such a way that we could return even to the horizons of the tens and talking about things like Medicare for all in a not stupid, not bullshit way, in a serious way. To get to that point, we need to raise our level of ability to think. We need new intellectuals in our generation that are real intellectuals and not people who are running around scared of what the DSA or their university department thinks of them. You have the potential to actually make a real material intervention into not just knowledge production, but in Bildung, into the making of people. Yeah. This is something that we can do. There's a window right now where I am not in the university, and so I have a real reason to think very seriously about, can we do something else? Because I'm annoyed, myself with the whole process of trying to be in that. And I would like there to be something else, something better. I have all my critiques of it that come in part from being at Cambridge, in part from studying ancient thinkers. We could do something better than it. Not just something that is an imitation or steals some things from it and does the best you can with it, but something that actually is better and that produces the kind of theory that in modernity, how do you make a Hegel? How do you make a Marx? We have to reinvent this. It's no longer possible to do that. We've got to, I think, actually institutionalize in a material way, and this is the sense in which I will uphold the kernel of materialism, actually giving a shit about the structure and what kind of structure is necessary to give rise to a form of life in which this kind of really, really good work can be produced.
Back, baby. Welcome back, everybody. Look at this. Look at this group of beautiful people here at Theory Underground. It's great to have you all here in the chat. I see a bunch of you have been getting a lot out of this. Shout out to Mandy and Brown Bunny and Mills 8102. Got a bunch of people on the public side. Great to have you all here. We're not obviously keeping up with the chat very much, but yes, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the production. Thanks for helping us with clarifying questions. And yeah, so with that said, okay, what do we want to do here with this next segment? This is going to be a little bit more community driven. And we'll start out by letting Sean say anything that he wants to say before we move forward. And of course, he's setting a great precedent. He said this to me on the phone last night. One of the big responsibilities that he feels is not defending himself, and like it's that's the problem with like a workshop, is like that kind of tension always arises. But that's kind of why we led with Sean, is because he kind of is cognizant of these kinds of things. But nevertheless,
we're not doing it as a thesis defense. We're not interrogating him.
Right. But with that said, Sean.
Yeah, the only thing I just wanted to say now is that like I think Dave, you were kind of saying that like there's not a clear engagement with a lot of the milieu texts. It's not like necessarily spelled out in the piece. And like, I mean, the thing you said about Heidegger, I just felt like the Heideggerian jargon was so obvious that I didn't even feel the need to cite it, if you know what I mean. That's kind of what I was, but in general, like, I think there does need to be a lot more milieu stuff tied into the text, and that would help with the like sense that you're getting of the disembodied narrator. And I mean, this whole line of criticism really helps me to figure out like, this is the thing I'm most worried about with the piece, is like I hate drawing in like stuff about my personal life. My thought is just mostly like, who cares? Like, who cares who I am? Like, it doesn't fucking matter. But I think it has the consequence of like not giving enough what is it, ethos, like too much pathos, not enough ethos, if I'm using those terms right. And it's just like, yeah, I'm not coming down from Mount Sinai, but also I also feel like I hate disclaimers, and I just want to say it. And like, if you don't like it, then like, that's fine. You know what I mean? I just kind of want to say it. You know what I mean? So I'm like, I'm struggling with my voice in that sense.
Yeah. You kind of have two different options for resolving it. One is to do the kind of autofiction, I'm a worker, let me give you some perspective stuff, which will then allow you to get away with more stuff. The other, which would be to refuse the autofiction, would be to take it in a more academic direction, do the clarifications that would be necessary in the academic setting at the beginning, right? Say how far out you're applying this thesis, how widely are you applying it, make all of that clear from the jump. And then, that would give you some space. It's when you, in an academic paper, if you acknowledge these things up front and you go, here's what I'm going to do about these issues, people give you room. But if you don't acknowledge them, then people accuse you of not being aware.
And this gets to the problem of audience too, because like my audience is what I intend for the audience for this paper is like, I'm trying to write to the milieu. I am. I might not be effectively doing that, but I am, that is my goal. And so like, I did want to just convince people that like coming at the same ideas from a different angle is like, that's what I'm trying to do. So whether or not that was like clear, or whether or not that's, clear on the page is a different question, but that's kind of what I was going for. You know what I mean? So yeah, awesome. But it is, yeah, this is my audience for this paper. You know what I mean? So yeah.
Cool. And then let's just take a cue. Well, Kira, is it okay if we start with you? And then everybody else, just put your hands up if you want to say something. And I want Mikey and Benjamin and Nance also to raise their hands to get in the queue. But let's mix it up between members and turn committee, whatever the fuck we're called. Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, I think what stuck out to me as an area to go deeper, I'll quote from your paper here to start us off. Ideals such as solidarity, camaraderie, devotion, even compassion become almost symbolically impossible in such a world where what the spectacular other expects from us is to constantly not give a fuck. And that really like made me think of like apathy as a way of transcendence in this like impossible situation that feels inescapable. It made me think of irony as symbolic capital, how that fits in. And then what's the connection between that and young people not having sex, not doing drugs, not sneaking out at night. I really want to hear more about like, what do you think that the new forms of jouissance are that are emerging in this like shifting landscape? And I almost like want to encourage you to get like really visceral about that. I think that would be an interesting, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I just wanted to point out one other thing too, that I kind of want to make you self-conscious of, but I think in a good way. There are two places, only two, where you do you. And it's so interesting to see you do a you do you at the same time that you're critiquing that we always have to do a you do you. So you have a line that is, enjoy Beyonce all you want. And the other one, oh, here we go. And we're talking about Cardi B in this quote. And honestly, under the conditions, more power to her. And those both just sort of jumped out at me. And I thought that like maybe there's something there. Like it would be like if you're at least aware that they're there, they might be an interesting jumping off point. Because it's like, yeah, this compulsion, like we all have it, including you, and you have it even as you're in this essay. It's really hard to not ever do that. So yeah, I just wanted to point those out.
Jacob.
Well, I wanted to first, do my traditional woke Berkeley acknowledgement and thank you for your bravery in going first, Sean. This is a big deal to be the first person dragged across the coals in this fashion in front of a live studio audience. I really appreciate that, and bearing that in mind, I wanted to I think the that home audience, whoever is watching us on YouTube, I think they might not have access to the Zoom side chat, so they haven't necessarily seen all of our reactions. So I wanted to pick up one of the little conversations we were having about that super egoic no from earlier. This no of the father, or the no of the super ego, the super egoic father. And I was just I was wondering, and I want to credit our friend Jordan with this framing of lumpen versus PMC prohibitions. And I'm wondering, certainly the PMC would want us to all think we have the same no as them, but I'm wondering if you're seeing this distinction between the super egoic no for the working class and the super egoic no for the PMC, or if that's the same societal limit.
Is this a back and forth? I mean, I don't think we didn't clarify if this is a back and forth. I think, Sean, let it stack up. You've got a bunch of notes in front of you. You'll kind of get the floor for a bit here in a bit. So we'll take a couple more kind of points out. My hand is up, so I'll go next. As I just said in the chat, I haven't seen a lick of the chat on the Zoom side. Nothing. And so if there's anything else important there, make sure to raise your hand and signal boost it, because it's otherwise just in the chat. I've thought about disabling Zoom chat. I kind of don't like having Zoom chat and live stream chat. Like, it kind of makes it weird. But anyway, for now, just consider it all private, and it only happened between you and a couple other people, unless you do what Jacob just did, which was the right thing. So thank you, Jacob. I wanted to just bring up a little point, and it was It's on the phallus in Cardi B and Cardi B's performance. Was it wet ass pussy? And about how that is like it's a very phallic performance. And I think that this is something that we've talked about, we've thought about. It's been brought up and kicked around. And you know, this is, I think, you know, sort of in dialogue with Mikey's piece on the phallus. And yeah, so a woman can perform having the phallus, and then you say under the conditions, more power to her, but I want to live in the kind of world where a person doesn't have to do this. And I don't think that that's an essential point for you throughout this piece. But it is it's like a thing worth pointing out because it seems like a little anarchistic holdover, maybe like a habit. And so I kind of want to just, do you really think that, or are you kind of just used to saying it kind of you? And the reason I'm saying that is because why would I want to live in a world where people can't perform having the phallus? Why would I want to live in that world? And where in the history of humans have humans ever existed where that was the case? Even in primitive communism, someone's performing having the it factor. There's a chief, there's a council of women, whatever it is, someone's performing having it. And so teasing out the kind of what you mean there could also be a whole piece, right? Because this idea that like all power is bad, anybody acting like they have it figured out is bad, anybody doing that is just a pervert who can't accept the fact that they're lacking in split. That seems to be a very, very common sort of Democrat, knee-jerk, anarcho, egalitarianism you see very common in the sort of why theory spaces. And so it's like, but why? What the fuck is wrong with it? You know, put the blazer on, pretend you have it. It's a performance, but it sure beats the performance of acting like it doesn't matter or like you don't, like that's not real for you, right? Like I would rather have Trump than somebody who comes along and constantly is self-flagellating and acting like they don't have it. You know what I mean? Like Trump over Abigail Thorne. I'm just joking. Anyway, Nance, go.
I just wanted to respond to that. Did he say can't or don't have to perform? Because I do think there's a huge difference between can't perform and don't have to perform.
Ooh,
I agree.
yeah.
I want to live in a world where people don't have to do anything. So maybe if I can stick up for Sean a little bit here. What else was I good? I was actually going to say something about the ego ideal and the ideal ego, but I don't have it anymore. So if someone else has something right now, that'd be great.
Mikey?
Yeah. No, I'll just say that, and sorry, my phone, I don't know what the hell happened. I was driving home and the damn phone turned off. And I've been having this issue more. So my phone's like an iPhone 10 and it's dying. Anyway. So I think the only thing, again, I mentioned it earlier, but I think that there is like the superego that says no, like, yeah, that's the Freudian thing, and everybody before Lacan is gonna think of the superego as this incredibly like violent, you know, abrasive no. But that's the problem with it. Like, look, Freud couldn't separate big other from superego, and this when they're conflated, like this is my issue. So, all right, Tut does his thing with Lash in the book on the family, and the way he uses superego there is also like a problem for me, because it's like you're kind of like smashing big other and superego together. And the point is to understand, like, the law, when it gives a prohibition, like if you associate the prohibition with the superego, then you always make prohibition seem monstrous and evil, when in fact the big other's actually trying to help a kid. Like, the no is not the point is the no is liberatory. Like, it helps a child get situated in a world, and prohibitions are actually there to help regulate our behavior and make us have pleasure, make us have, you know, a meaningful way of comporting ourselves in the world with other people, right? If you super super egotize, however you want to say it, the no, then it just makes the no. This is the issue like D&G have with the no, is it turns the no into something that's just so violent and so mean and so cruel. And instead of seeing the no as like the thing that helps a child in a situation that it can't really get out of, like the introduction of the no is what separates the kid from the mother, from this sense of jouissance with the mother, dos ding, blah blah blah, and gives them a sense of independent selfhood. It's liberatory in that sense. The super egos, not the big other. And what the superego bombards us with is the enjoy or the yes. Yes, always be happy. Yes, be living your best life. Yes, live it all, experience it all, take it all in. And that's where the violence is, like, not in the no, it's in the fucking toxic yes, in the toxic positivity of the law that commands you to always be enjoying, to always be getting the most out of your life. That's the toxic dynamic. And so that's just, I think that once you separate these two functions of the law, because they're both aspects of the law, things get clearer when it comes to the prohibition. No longer is this violent, evil thing that, if it with Freud, it kind of seems like that's what it is because he didn't make the distinction. So I'll just say that.
There we go. And I would say now it's just kind of this is like segment 2. This is the sort of, we're all here. I'm going to go back to pinning all of us, and Sean, we'll start with you having the floor, and you get to ask us all questions. And we'll just kind of go from there. This is a bit more like a podcast between you and the other members of the turn.
Well, cool. Yeah, there's some things that I'm like, hearing some critiques that I'm like, yeah, that's fucking fair. There are some points where I'm like, well, I think that's exactly what I'm saying, like, and maybe it's my failure to articulate it. It could very well be, but what I'm saying about the superego, for instance, is the superego is permissive. That's why it's repressive. And that's a tricky point there, but like what I'm saying is more or less like, look, we're being severely distracted from finding ourselves. And that distraction is very positive. It's very and this ties into what Kier was saying too, is like, I'm like, yeah, my point is like, and I say this pretty clearly, I'm like, look, when your friend tells you you do you, that's a different message than when the corporation tells you you do you. When the advertisement tells you you do you. Those are not the same. That's not the same thing. And that's the point of the whole like pseudo culture element of this, is like the media spectacle. It's really good at being like saying what we want to hear and just repeating it, repeating something that like we already want to hear that a friend might tell us. And in that way, it's becoming our friend, and we think it's becoming our friend, but it's not your friend. You know what I mean? It's depriving you more and more of your time. It's depriving you more and more of your, it's distracting you. It's depriving you more and more of the ability to find yourself. And it's really this positivity that's doing that. So that's on the superego. I wanted to say that. And I seem to, and I might have failed to articulate like maybe the primary point, because one thing I'm trying to get at, and maybe this is being heard, maybe it's not, I don't know, but it's that like the reason why it's a tricky transition, I'm going from like the parents to the corporations, because the corporations are our collective parent, our collective permissive parent. Is kind of the point I'm trying to make. And I don't know if that's something that I don't know if that's a legitimate jump to make. I don't, but it's the jump I'm trying to make, And it's not that on that point, it's not that narcissism is the whole, narcissism is everything we are, but it is everywhere. You know what I mean? So that gets to the whole problem that Benjamin was talking about the scope issue. So that's what I want to say. I want to say it's everywhere. I don't want to say that it's like, all of everyone, you know? So I think it's kind of the ruling ideology. This is what I'm trying to say. I think it's the ruling ideology, but that doesn't mean that it's, and this is why at the very end, I'm like, look, there is a gap. There is hope because it's not completely defining us, and it can't completely define us. And this is the problem with the board. This is the problem with the Society of the Spectacle. The vibe you get, at least from reading the Society of the Spectacle, you're like, there's no hope. We're all fucked. It's just all pervasive, all consuming. At least this is the vibe I got from reading it. And so there's literally nothing we can do. And so maybe this essay is bringing that across. But what I was trying to do at the very end and the conclusion was just be like, yo, yeah, no, it's not though. You know, it's not all consuming. There is still hope. We do still have agency. We do still exist. But it's the system's trying to like actively convince us that we don't exist. So
this is what made me think of the post-war era. And this is what made me think of a lot of the post-war theorists like Althusser. There's a structure, it has a unitary character, it's everywhere, but it doesn't necessarily completely condition everyone, is very much of a piece with kind of Frankfurt School, structuralist French theory. It very much fits that kind of late modernism. Yeah.
I was rereading, like, it's One-Dimensional Man. I was rereading some Marcuse, and I was like, yeah, the first time I read him, I didn't take him seriously enough. Like, there's some real good shit in there. And I think, anyway.
Yeah, it's very mid-century. That piece, it's an incredibly mid-century piece, which is why the neoliberalism thing kind of came up for me. This question of, is this really about neoliberalism, or is this really a continuation of the dialogue about the post-war system? And some people think that the concept of neoliberalism is unhelpful and that we should regard the neoliberal period as a continuation of the post-war system with some tweaking or some mild modification. It's an interesting question. Usually the post-war era and neoliberalism are sharply distinguished as two different things.
Well, like certainly like repressive desublimation, that's still a thing, in Marcuse. Like that's totally still a thing. Like the bringing high art down to the level of commercial art, like that hasn't changed, era to the neoliberal era. So there's some things that I think are if anything more intensified, and that's sort of the emphasis I was trying to place, is that there's certain things that are carrying
in the
through.
neoliberal era, certain things would be more intensified than they were in the post-war era. Yeah, but then this would quite strongly militate against the kind of standard tendency to say that neoliberalism, certain things have changed, right? Usually in the neoliberal era, it gets claimed that things have changed and not necessarily just gone in one direction from the post-war era, but that there's been maybe a pluralizing or a fracturing or something.
Yeah, I think sort of superficially things have changed. Sorry, I'm getting a notification. My internet connection is unstable. Can you still hear me, everybody?
Good so far.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'm, but I think like, what was I saying? Where was I going with that? I totally lost my train of thought when that message came up. So, yeah. See if I can come back to it.
Neoliberalism, post-war era.
Oh, I see neoliberalism in as an extension of just managerialism. And that's been going on. Well, that's one of the things Lash is talking about. And I think like it's a different form of managerialism, but it still is, it's still society ruled by managers, and that's different than the post-war era, but it's still managerialism. It's still certainly not democracy, or not democratic, I should say. So yeah, those are some thoughts. I'll shut up for a little bit.
Cleo, if I can encourage you, this message in the chat where you say, "So Sean, are you arguing?" If you're comfortable, I'd like you to present that because that's a great comment.
Oh, just a question of clarification. Would it be, Sean, would it be in accordance with your stance here to make the claim that you're using narcissism as a paradigmatic formation? And therefore elevating it slightly up above what Benjamin is suggesting, which is an array of such formations of which it is one, but not making the claim that it's universal. I'm a long life of trying to wriggle out of academic traps. I'm trying to show you a wriggle out. But I don't know if it's the one you want.
Yeah, I like that.
Oh, very awkward, by the way, Sean. This is my disclaimer. I have an ethic that makes me not want to comment on anything I haven't read, and I've only skimmed the part of the paper that's been on the screen. So forgive me. I'm just going by the chat, okay?
Yeah, no, I do like that. I think paradigmatic, like maybe if I'd used that framing, perhaps
It's
that
clever.
would have avoided the whole problem, you
It's
know?
clever.
So
Use it myself.
Yeah. I probably still would have pushed on it myself, but if you had
Yeah.
framed it that way, it would have been, you would have clarified the position you were taking, and therefore it would have been a position, maybe not mine, but a position.
Yeah.
Something I want to challenge Sean and Mikey in their own ways. I don't know who would want to do it or how to potentially do here is to kind of, now that we've thought a little bit more about Sean's take, now that we're a little bit more familiar with it ostensibly, to bring it back into that conversation, that panel that we had at TUCon, to bring it back into relation to Dwayne and Mark and Brenner and Todd. I want to know what are the political theory question and the implications for political theory and the questions of rigor and milieu and all of that. Bracket that for a moment and just let's focus on psychoanalysis. Generalized foreclosure is kind of how this gets talked about by Dwayne and Mark. But I am a terrible student of the whole psychoanalytic side of things here. Meaning I'm trying, guys, but it's really hard. And I just kind of, I'm wondering if either of you wants to take a stab at kind of saying, what are the different positions on like these sort of claims about what is paradigmatic and what's under the hood there? What's working across these different accounts? And then I just like to see something get situated in contrast. You know what I mean?
I mean, honestly, I need to spend more time with their work for sure. I have spent some time, but not enough. That's kind of my cheap answer. But I do think that, yeah, I don't know. If Mikey has something to say, I would love to hear what he has to say about this. But
look, I mean, the issue is that the way that I feel like Dwayne talks about this kind of slides from here to there. And so at one point, I feel like I understand what's going on. At other points, I don't. Like, for example, like a year ago, 2 years ago, he was critiquing toxic positivity. Now he's critiquing critiques of toxic positivity. So I don't know where he's at from one day to the next. And I mean, I think he would tell you that's part of what he does is he just keeps critique going. But look, I mean, generalized foreclosure basically has to do with the powerlessness, impotence of the name of the father. And so generalized foreclosure, you think would have to do with psychosis, because how do we define psychosis? Well, psychosis is the foreclosure of the name of the father. But the point is, this is where this whole conversation gets complicated, and
because then Dwayne will say, well, it's not just the name of the father that gets foreclosed. There's other things that get foreclosed for Lacan. Now, if you go read Bruce Fink's book on Intro to Clinical Structures, he's going to talk about the foreclosure of the name of the father, which that's what most Lacanians do. Dwayne's found these points in Lacan where he talks about foreclosure of other things. I'm drawing a blank on what they are right now. And so it's like, oh, well, then there's generalized foreclosure doesn't have to mean the generalized foreclosure of the name of the father. And I go, okay, but that's ultimately what the point is about generalized foreclosure. But it ultimately has to do with some sort of weakening of the symbolic authority. But Zizek and Jody Dean and like a lot of these other Lacanian theorists have long been emphasizing this, that what kind of defines post-war consumer capitalism is a weakening of the paternal function, and that human beings have less and less of a sense of duty to their symbolic orders, to causes, and more have fallen in to having a sense of duty to their own selves and their own enjoyment. And so in Ticklish Subject, and Sean, I was going to recommend this to you, Zizek talks about this circuit between the imaginary and the real. And his point is that individuals now, like, yeah, everything's based around either their egos, they're, cultivating their sense of self in the, the capitalist consumer sense, or their jouissance, their forms of enjoyment. And what is weakened is any sense of duty to the symbolic order, to the social order, to a cause, etc. Right? And so for Zizek, he thinks this is part of this problem, is this, this diminishing effect of the symbolic. And so it does, it kind of, and so one way Dwayne and Mark will talk about it, a la the later Lacan of, the Lacan of the synthome and all this, is to talk about it as islands of jouissance. Like it's harder and harder for us to have the social bond, the social link, right? Which is to say some sort of collective sense of duty that gives us a shared identity, etc. And we're just kind of little atomistic islands of enjoyment. Not, like communication's harder and harder because we're also fragmented, post-class fractured mass. We're also fragmented that nobody can form meaningful symbolic consensus anymore, right? This is where all of this kind of stuff goes. It doesn't mean that we're all literally psychotic. Of course, we understand prohibitions. Of course, we know that little things like when you walk into the grocery store, this is my example that I used with Dwayne. I'm like, it can't be generalized foreclosure of the name of the father, because I know goddamn well that I can't just walk behind the counter at the grocery store. Like, I follow these procedures. I understand prohibition, right? It still is operative, but it's not operative in the sense of like what organizes my existential project, in the sense like my existential project is just me and my little idiosyncratic identity, rolling around in my jouissance, trying to do shit, build up my ego, right? So that's it, like the only way to make sense of it is, to me, at the existential level, and not at the actual like we're not literal psychotics in the Lacanian sense. And so the thing for me though is I don't think we even have to do this thing talking about generalized foreclosure. My term for it is super ego oriented neurosis. And this is Zizek's point. This is Todd's point, is that what happens with capitalism, especially consumer capitalism, is that it diminishes the no because it wants to sell products. It wants us to enjoy. It turns consumption, it turns enjoyment into a duty. And that's this push that we feel. YOLO, all this kind of stuff, live your best life. So like if you feel your lack at all, like you're supposed to not lack, no matter how much you lack, right? And that's what tortures us about the superego pressure is that we're just constantly supposed to be enjoying and happy and living our best lives, when that is not possible given our economic conditions, given our the state of our, mental health, all of these factors that are at play in our shitty situation. But somehow, to keep up appearances, ideologically speaking, we're all supposed to, be happy. Well, that's the torturous thing, is to, always be goaded on to appear to be happy. And on this, we do this on social media. Nobody, okay, some people break the fucking rule and, do their sad posting or whatever. But if you actually look at normies always just post, oh, look at us on vacation. Look at this restaurant we're at. Look, they never post whatever real contradictions or lacks they're facing in their life. The normies are this great instance of where you see the superego guiding what they're posting on social media. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
I'd only say unless that normie got radicalized by the therapism discourse, in which case they start treating Facebook like their journal entries, and like every vulnerable thing they say publicly is radical, which you do see happen. And then you go, oh, could you go back to just positive posting?
There is one thing I want to interject in, and I want to two things about Jacob. First of all, I wanted you to repeat your question that you asked in the Zoom, because I think I didn't fully follow. But I also wanted to say, you said something in the chat about ordinary psychosis. How close are we all at any moment to ordinary psychosis? This is why and what Mikey was talking about, I framed it around ordinary psychosis, because I think it clarifies a lot of the things that are sort of like confusing about the foreclosure of the name of the father thing. It's like that's why I say, like, language is, it's not that it's like language is moving away from us. You know what I mean? It's like that the place of like of the parent, both of like the maternal function and the paternal function, are sort of like not really rooted in the family in the same way that they used to be. Like, I don't think we care what our parents think, like in the same way that we used to in earlier epochs. And like the more we go into this like neoliberal capitalism, I think the family in some respects becomes less and less important. And in some respects it might also become more and more important, just in the fact that like we're falling back on the family also because society's kind of disintegrating and a lot of the structures are sort of falling apart. So there's kind of a double movement there too going on. So that does give more credence to what Benjamin is saying about like, yeah, it's not one thing happening, and I think this piece kind of gives the impression that like there's one thing happening. And I also don't like that. There's a lot of things happening, but there is kind of a disintegration of the social fabric is what I'm getting at. And that has to do with, and this is how I take ordinary psychosis from, and that's coming from Jacques-Alain Miller. He has a great essay that I cite in the paper on it. And so, yeah, read that, because other people are going to come to different conclusions about it than I did, certainly. But it's a really good essay, and it's really accessible too. And I think it's very, very clarifying. So, yeah. But I wanted Jacob to have a chance to like, I don't know if I followed your question that you asked in the Zoom completely. So,
well, it was as always a very rambling question. I'll try to keep it shorter, if not more direct. So in terms of that no, and the no of the father and that prohibition, and the enjoyment and the narcissism that comes out of it, I'm wondering if there's a class distinction to that narcissism, between, say, the lumpen folks and the PMC folks. And I think the latter would definitely, if so, I would think the latter would definitely want us to all assume that their narcissism is of the same sort as the rest of ours.
I don't know. I mean, okay, do you think you can say a little bit more about like why they might be different?
Well, I mean, our I would think that the PMC of nature might have a different relationship to the super egoic function than uh the office manager might have a different relationship to know than the forklift operator downstairs in the
Yeah.
warehouse, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the only thought I have on that is just like, uh, I think that the way someone comes to narcissism when they're the one getting gentrified out of their community versus the way that someone comes to it when they are the one sort of in the machine that's doing that to a community. I think they're both forms of narcissism, but they are very different. So I think but they still somehow to me seem like, yeah, they're both forms of like, you don't really exist. You're in a system and your social fabric is being destroyed. And so your basis for saying that you exist is being eroded because you exist in connections. You exist out of a social fabric, I believe, and so you're trying to reconstitute yourself in this wasteland of not having these strong social connections. And I think both the manager and the worker are doing that kind of for different reasons, for different ways, in different ways. So I'm kind of more sympathetic to the person who's being like trying to reconstitute themselves as they've been destroyed versus the person who kind of like gives all of their sort of buys into the ideology like right off the bat from the corporation. So yeah.
Well, when you buy into the ideology, you inherently start building yourself in the image of the PMC, of the PMC community, rather than the lumpen community you once had. Maybe you leave your community and you go to college or something like that, and then you wind up in whatever suburb afterwards.
But I wonder now at this point, like, what are other people hearing when we're talking about this? This is what I want to know is like, because there's a lot to say, but I'm like, what are you actually hearing? Like, so.
From the standpoint of a person who's just become aware that we are over the 3-hour mark, actually, I think that what we want to do is open up a bunch of cans of worms in close so that people want to continue these conversations in the comment section and on Discord and next week, etc. And so closing thoughts. Let's get some closing thoughts. I know, and then Benjamin, Mikey, Nance, we'll all say our bit. Sean can say a sign off. We'll be out of here in 10 minutes. I'll start by just saying the corporate other is really useful for thinking about. I really want to dive deeper into the corporate other. I want to flesh it out. And the way that I've sort of laid the basis for fleshing that out with Sociology 101 and how I taught it over the last, I talk about the institutional matrix. Not all institutions are created equal. There are the ideas of the institutions versus the realities of the institutions. And the realities on the ground can be different from locality to locality, but the general legitimation narratives of those institutions tend to be the same. So there's a legitimation narrative of the state, of academia, of the church. And then there's that would usually be the idea of that institution. And then there's the reality of that institution. What is it functionally actually doing now? And the contradiction between the idea and what it's functionally actually doing, who does it actually serve, or what functions does it actually serve, that's a big one for me. And thinking about the double-sidedness of the big other versus superego, whether it's the same thing or if these are different things, this is something Rudy brought up in the chat on the live side. I think that's a really, really worthwhile line of thought. It's something that I think about all the time. And this is where we're officially no longer in psychoanalysis, but we're doing socioanalysis. At the point that we're doing socioanalysis and we're thinking about habitus and field and the structuration of our life worlds via institutions and how everything's institutionalized. We might want to think a little bit with Althusser, repressive versus ideological, right? And my basic thing that I go with is that you have the one side saying no and the other side saying yes. Repressive is saying no, ideological is saying yes. Althusser is keen on the fact that there's overlap between these things in any institution. There's primarily repressive versus primarily ideological, but of course the school has detention, which is prison, right? Like the school has an element of the prison in it, and the prison has an element of the school in it, because recovery and self-help, AA, celebrate recovery, etc. So it's almost like there's mommy and daddy being repressive, and repressive being daddy, ideological being mommy. Of course, like and this is where it gets really complicated, right? Do we want to say that how a person forms in their earliest years is going to determine which of these institutions they relate to more, or vibe with versus against, right? Democrats are obviously for teachers and against cops, and Republicans are for cops and against teachers. One side, the daddy side, takes the repressive apparatus side, but this is a very superficial analysis. I'm very zoomed out. I'm very, very just generalizing in this sort of grandiose way. It creates problems. It should create problems. It shouldn't bring easy answers. But this is stuff we have to think about. How much of the stuff happening in the home is a mirror of what's going on with those institutions, or vice versa? Is it really just like we can say, oh, well, the one affects the other and the other affects the one, and it's just back and forth and it's all dialectical and all cows are black, right? Or do we want to really tarry with the ways that things get more complicated and unpack that? That's a big question. The other thing I wanted to point out was that Jacob had also said something about the natural no. The workers face a natural no. There's a big difference between a natural no and a socially constructed no. If you're a billionaire, even death itself might be a socially constructed obstacle you could overcome to a certain extent, right? You could just keep replacing body parts until, we have to do the ship of Theseus thing on you. It's like, okay, now that you've had a brain replacement, Bill Gates, are you still Bill Gates? I don't know. But being able to replace your organs or being able to get a nose job, like those are the kinds of things that you can do if you have healthcare or if you belong to the professional. I don't even know if ruling class. We'll just say ruling class for sure. There are fewer natural no's being enforced. But when you are a worker or underclass, he brought in the lumpen. The point is that there are necessary no's and then there are natural no's. And these are not always the same things. Those have to be teased out. There's different kinds of no's. And I wanted to say that, like, the no of the parent that is enforcing a socially constructed no versus a necessary and natural no might be different. And I wanted to bring in the no of love, right? The no of love versus the no of, as a parent, this is my job to tell you no, right? The don't run out in the street is because I don't want you to die. That's a very different.
That's what I was trying to get at, with how the no is not just automatically some violent, oppressive, no, the no of love. I'm trying to help you with the no.
Yeah. So that's just, I wanted to problematize the natural, the necessary, and the good, right? It's a theme we keep coming back to, versus the normal. The normal is not necessarily natural. It's not necessarily good. It's definitely not necessarily necessary. But teasing out that there's different kinds of no's being conflated within different households would be one way of getting to the fracturing of the mass that's going on. And we have to think about the permissiveness of the smartphone and what is the message of that medium. It's not always yes. And Nance, you're excited. You go next. I'm done. Thank you so much.
Like, with the smartphone, Jesus Christ, I got thrown for a loop. We are coming into a new relation with natural no's. Like we're becoming cyborgs. We already are cyborgs, and that's a different can of worms. Language necessarily means we're cyborgs because it's this thing that's outside of us and it's a tool that blah, blah, blah. We use it, it uses us. But like, we are materially changing into new creatures. And to think that subjectivity and the structures of subjectivity don't need to be updated from the 1940s, I think is silly. So I'm really excited when we're actually out here trying to innovate on the clinical structures and how we interpret them and use them to see things in the world. I wanted to bring up a question about ideal ego and ego ideal, and does I think second order observation is similar enough to ideal ego that I prefer to use second order observation, this systems theory thing, to think about ideal ego. But I think there's maybe some new mystical third idealized ego ideal or something that comes out of the accelerated version of second order observation that we have, because it is true that this is not all just in the symbolic. It is true that we are discovering new capabilities, like the material field of possibilities for a human being is different today, and it will be different tomorrow, and it will be the case that soon we will be ships of Theseus ourselves. And we already kind of are with our devices, with the fact that no longer is our subjectivity only extant in language. Our subjectivity is also extant in devices. I can outsource memory. I can outsource emotion. Like, we're offloading them we're taking the split and moving it from this internal split into this reified organic versus mechanical or synthetic split or whatever. And I just think that's super duper interesting, but that's a can of worms. Sean, I want to thank you sincerely for doing this, for being turn one, genuinely. Thank you for exposing yourself exposing yourself to the kind of risk.
I do want to know, does anyone think that I'm not like reading this essay? I'm on team no. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, I think no is good. So I'm wondering if is that what people are hearing?
No, we got that. It's clear.
Okay. All right. That's cool.
It's clear. By the way, Sean, one of my comments that was like a sassy one, but it's convenient to bring it in right now, was just like, whenever I hear this, and I do kind of consider this to be a sort of Y theory kind of discourse, but of course it's also Zizekian, I always just think, wow, that's a long-winded and theoretically jargon-heavy way of saying conservatives were right about something. It's like, how do we say conservatives are right but piss them off at the same time? Yeah.
Well, let's be honest. Lacan never shied away from the fact that he was conservative. He thought all the Maoist students were getting way ahead of themselves. That's why he said, yeah, you guys desire a master. You're going to get one.
It wasn't at some point like an idea of some sense of like being conservative? Wasn't that at some point on the left? Like, I mean, Marx is a critique of capital. Capital is the thing that,
is liberal.
Is the thing that's just what's the phrase? Everything solid melts into air. Like, there's a conservatism on the left, or at least there used to be. And I think that's Lash seeing this change on the left slowly start to happen. And then it's me like being like, okay, I see Lash seeing that happen, and it's just gotten worse. Like, yeah, that's all I have to say. It's just like, yeah, there's something conservative in opposing the worst about capitalism, the worst about monopoly and corporate capitalism. There's something conservative about that, and that, yeah, I don't understand why the left has abandoned the idea of anything being conserved at all. That's the impression you get sometimes. Anyway, go ahead, Mike.
One thing
Jacob,
that came up in the chat that we didn't really get to bounce in is the question of whether the discussion of devolution as a concept can be approached on non-conservative or non-reactionary terms, or if to discuss devolution at all, we're inherently engaging in some sort of reactionary process.
I just
can I
want to
just
interject.
oh,
Hold on.
yeah.
Since I am the one that raised that question, I don't want to be taken as I'm imbuing or attributing conservatism or reactionaryism to the notion of devolution. I'm saying that no, that's like taking this progress for the sake of progress seriously and believing it and internalizing it and unproblematically kind of incorporating it into the worldview. So I wouldn't say it's conservative or reactionary to be critical of devolution. I would say it's being critical of a teleological thinking. Like that's just, I'm not trying to moralize. I'm just saying let's not be teleological. Let's not assume that there's a necessary path forward. Let's make sure it stays contingent.
Closing thoughts, Mikey.
Also, I will just say, I mean, if you think something human ought to make it out of the near future, you're a conservative in a sense. And this is why Land is very much aware of like, no, you honestly, humanism, and by humanism, if you view it in his terms, is conservatism. We ain't seen nothing yet. Because as body modification, as this AI, as all this stuff amps up, at some point we approach this threshold, and it's not going to be abstract science fiction to normies anymore. It's going to be shit about their kids. Are their kids going to be cyborgs? And yes, we can do the thing where we're already cyborgs, but I mean in a different sense.
Monkey tails.
And yeah, right. Think face tentacles, right? It becomes a real issue, and that's where Land's like, no, like he agrees with what's the guy, I'm drawing a blank, that talks about the war between AI and humans.
DeGaris.
DeGaris. Yeah. He's like, no, this shit's going to happen. I'll just say that. So if you're on the side of somehow humanity making it out of, the near future, then there's a sense where you're conservative. Second, the funny thing about schools and the repressive apparatus versus the ideological, what seems to be the most repressive dimension of schools nowadays are the students. Like honestly, and I don't know how bad it still is, but there was a point where the woke students could get you fired. They could get you, So I just think it's interesting that actually it's the students that are functioning in this way. Second, or the other thing is like, as far as the no of love, this is what D&G just missed. And I'll just say it like this. Look, if they're all about desiring production and machinic connections between parts of bodies and parts of other bodies, and this should just not be impeded. It shouldn't be inhibited. Well, okay, I guess a little baby with his hand, that's the hand's the partial object, right? It's it wants to connect to the partial object that is an electrical outlet and get a flow. Well, okay, yeah, flow of electricity. No, when the parent says no, like it's a no of love. Like and yes, you are breaking apart the desiring production by not letting the hand go and touch the electrical outlet. And yeah, I'm sure Deleuze Guattarians go, oh, that's not what they have in mind. Okay, well then tell me exactly how the parent's supposed to just instruct the kids that they can't make whatever desiring machines they feel spontaneously impulse to do. Like you do it with a no. Like the no is the machinery of love that a parent uses to keep kids from anyway. So just want to add that, Sean, I've loved your piece and thank you for doing this. This has been great. And I think you have all the potential in the world as a theorist and look forward to seeing what you do next.
Last thoughts, Benjamin?
Yeah, so I want to say a little bit about Marx here. Marx is committed to going through capitalism for the purposes of redeeming the things that came from before, that were previously alienated from working people. All of those traditions that previously could only belong to the elite become the workers by going through capitalism and getting to some kind of endpoint within it, right? The problem is that there's a question about whether going through capitalism really does have that result, or does it have many possible results? Is there a thicket of different things that can happen? Because does capitalism go in only one direction? Does it have only one path? Or is there some level of multiplicity of possibilities within it? And then, depending on what we do might affect which possibility we end up with. Depending on what else is going on, outside of capitalism, in the world of states and in the other aspects of human life that aren't necessarily something we can fully account for under the rubric of capitalism. These things create these other possibilities, and that's why it's so important, I think, to think very seriously about whether capitalism is one thing that goes one place, or is it a space of possibility that we operate within? And if it's a space of possibility that we operate within, and it has multiple different kinds of outcomes, both in any given moment and across time, then it's much more complicated. And then it becomes a real challenge to figure out how to find your way through it. Sometimes I think of capitalism as a vast desert, as this thing we have to cross, right? And if you had a compass or if you knew the stars, you could just walk across it, right? But sometimes I think of capitalism as a spooky forest where you can get lost, and there's many different places you might wander as you're going through. And so as I was listening to Sean's piece and listening to this discussion, I think that for me is the key question. This kind of, the moderns held on to this idea that there was one thing that you were going through, and it might have a good ending or it might have a bad ending, but it was going one place. And you could affirm it or you could negate it, but it was going one place. And now I think we're not so sure that it's going one place. And so then that does open up these further questions, which make it hard to produce something that's satisfying. A theory that would have been satisfying to us in the middle of the 20th century won't necessarily satisfy us in the same way now, because we have this thought about this postmodern question of, is it a spooky forest? And that's insofar as I have any kind of challenge, and I would issue the challenge because I think Sean has written something really interesting here. And I think that it merits taking up the challenge of that possibility of multiplicity and how far stuff goes and exactly how far. Because if it's one thing, then it will become easier than it really is to say what we should do. So that's why I press on it. I press on it because it's such an interesting thought. What if we update all the other things? What's going on with the neurotics? What's going on with the perverts? Are they gone? Are they still here? What's going on with, increasingly people are talking about autism as potentially a category. How are they interfacing? As the one develops and becomes stronger, does it interface with the others? Does it affect them? I think there's further possibilities for this. And that's why I'm pushing on this point. So I'm going to close by continuing to push on that point.
I love it. That's a great framing.
I just want to say it is. I love what you're saying, but it's like instead, because I mean, look, the kind of traditional dogmatic Marxist just says, oh, there's just this dialectical necessity that there's a absolute trajectory we're on that goes from capitalism to socialism, communism, right? And I think you're right. And tell me what you think. What you're getting at is that capitalism is a phase space. Like there's all these possibilities within it. And instead of acting like there's just one clear trajectory down a certain path, there's all these different possibilities brewing within it all at once. And we have to think that multiplicity of potential instead of getting locked into some like absolute trajectory.
Yeah, and it might be that the complexity eventually narrows down again. Like when you're playing a role-playing game and there's a part of this game where you have 24 branching different paths, and then they come back together at some later point. It might be that eventually it comes back together at some later point. If you get out of the spooky forest, then you would come into a clearing. But yeah, these are the things that
we can all hope the adventure gets back on the rails at some point.
And shouldn't we be asking which things we want to conserve and which things we're okay with consigning to the dustbin of history? Like what's important to hold on to? What is it was just kind of there and no one really liked it anyway?
Well, then there's the stuff that you might have to give up so that you can bring it back. Sometimes you have to give something up for a little bit so it can come back later. And I think for Marx, a lot of these old traditions have to go away in one form so that they can come back at a later point in a different and potentially better or more universal form.
Also,
so once they're no longer alienated from the worker, then they become better in some way than they were. But sometimes in the process of being claimed by the worker, they get lost for a while.
Everybody, thank you so much. Take care.
You can support the free and public work at TU by becoming a patron over at Patreon. But if you would like to get involved and become a member at Theory Underground so that you can listen to special content that is not accessible to anyone else, or if you go up a subscriber level, actually join in the discussions, or at the top level, have us actually read your work, giving constructive feedback, and ultimately paving a way to potentially being a part of what we call the turn, then you'll want to become a subscriber. That's how you will access the ongoing courses and seminars. We've brought together Benjamin Studebaker's experience in political theory and science and philosophy with my critical social theory, phenomenology, existentialism, critique of political economy, critical media theory approach, combined with Michael Downes's fault line theory, the CCRU versus Ljubljana School, or Žižek versus Land. And of course, how he brings those against one another and then transcends them through other thinkers like Baudrillard, who he'll be teaching an intro course to in 2025. All of us are teaching stuff in 2025 that rhymes or argues or goes together. And so the best way to accelerate your development getting into theory right now is to just become a subscriber at TU. Just go to the website, click get involved, and what I'm about to play for you all is a really special moment from our documentary that we're working on, an interview where Benjamin explains why he's supporting Theory Underground and getting involved as a active member here at the core of the teaching team.
Yeah, so the thing that I notice is that a lot of people criticize the university, they criticize the left, they don't build an alternative institution. They will go, the university sucks, but you know what's great? Substack and Patreon and YouTube, and they'll lean into that. But that is a negation, right? You guys don't do that. You guys are interested in sublating the university within the newly emergent media. Or you could frame it the other way, sublating the newly emergent media within the university, right? And so this, of course, will ultimately lead, if you take it where it goes, to a question of institutions and having actual economic, social role possibilities for theorists. This is the critical crisis, which is that there are still some very bright, very well-educated people, but they are not able to replace themselves. And because most of them have university positions, their level of interest in replacing themselves is to some degree compromised.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry that much about themselves. They don't have that much stake in it because they're already set up. However, because you aren't in the underground, you have some potential of being able to actually create an institution or structure which makes it possible for people to do theory in the future. This is something that, as far as I can tell, only you are doing. The thing about freeing Mikey from wage labor, this idea not only that your channel would free you from the Amazon job, but that this could grow in such a way that it could provide spaces for multiple people, and then those multiple people could interact in the way that they would in a monastery or in a university department. This is the revolutionary idea in terms of raising consciousness and making it possible for us to think in such a way that we could return even to the horizons of the tens and talking about things like Medicare for all in a not stupid, not bullshit way, in a serious way. To get to that point, we need to raise our level of ability to think. We need new intellectuals in our generation that are real intellectuals and not people who are running around scared of what the DSA or their university department thinks of them. You have the potential to actually make a real material intervention into not just knowledge production, but in Bildung, into the making of people. Yeah. This is something that we can do. There's a window right now where I am not in the university, and so I have a real reason to think very seriously about, can we do something else? Because I'm annoyed, myself with the whole process of trying to be in that. And I would like there to be something else, something better. I have all my critiques of it that come in part from being at Cambridge, in part from studying ancient thinkers. We could do something better than it. Not just something that is an imitation or steals some things from it and does the best you can with it, but something that actually is better and that produces the kind of theory that in modernity, how do you make a Hegel? How do you make a Marx? We have to reinvent this. It's no longer possible to do that. We've got to, I think, actually institutionalize in a material way, and this is the sense in which I will uphold the kernel of materialism, actually giving a shit about the structure and what kind of structure is necessary to give rise to a form of life in which this kind of really, really good work can be produced.